dive right in. Ashley's going to be a few minutes late. So welcome to tonight's meeting of Montpelier City Council. This is a special meeting. We are focused exclusively on, or almost exclusively, I guess we'll approve minutes, but other than that, zoning bylaws. I'm thinking 10 o'clock is kind of an outset, 3.5 hours. Let's see where we are.
Good goal. Good goal.
We got to get through it. And maybe we'll be sooner. Maybe we'll make quicker progress. We do have an item of general business and appearances. If anybody's here to talk about anything other than zoning, I don't think so. Okay. Tom, you're not here for zoning, so. Oh, okay. Good. Okay. Do we have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Good luck.
And then I was going to suggest that because we have folks here from VCFA, they have a very specific zoning proposal. We take that up first. It's not in our matrix. It kind of sits outside the matrix. So if there's no objection, we'll do that one first. Okay. Mike, you want to? Oh, yes. I'm sorry, Alan. And we have had a comment period. Would you like to do that now? Is that the?
Whatever you prefer.
Why don't you do that? Why don't we go ahead and do that? Take your, just do a comment. That'd be great. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. All I'm here to talk about, thank you, everybody, are the footprints. You've thought about a new reduced size, and I just want you to think about it. It's 2,500 feet as a suggestion for a bunch of the districts. So that would be with porches and garages attached. I could do a 2,000 square foot home.
I think I need you to...
Hold on just a second, Alan. I'm going to just orient everybody. Mike, have you handed this chart out?
This one.
So just to provide context, this was the discussion we had about about the maximum footprint being potentially too high.
I do, thank you.
So Mike has put in a recommendation to us to lower these that are pretty substantial reductions, and I think Alan wanted to address that proposal.
Well, yes, in fact, the list that you see are the suggested ones that we have in the bylaws that we're trying to adopt. Then for some reason we've gone to a smaller set. And I would just point out that 2,500 square foot footprint is really small. So if you do a 2,000 square foot home in a garage, which is usually 546 or 576, I'm over the top. You know, my dad lost his leg, so we had to redesign his life for a one-story existence. And so I was just curious why we've gone so small. And then for me, I love covered porches. That's my thing. So I really want to have a wraparound porch on my house, at least 2 sides, maybe even 3, and then my garage. So if I did a 2,000 square foot home with a wraparound 6 or 8 foot porch, I'm hitting almost 4,000 square feet for my first floor footprint, and I don't think I'm building that big of a house. And so I'm asking you to consider maybe taking the porches out of the footprint. And then they say the garage, if you detach it, it's not in the footprint. But as I get older and want to live on 1 story, I want to go in the cold. I want to go from my warm house to my warm garage, which I've never done in my life. I've only had a cold car for 40 plus years. So I just wanted you to please think about that. I know where you're going. And I would ask 2 things. Think about a little bit bigger footprint. Think about ADA folks who will need it. And then think about like on Res 6 or 9,000 where I'm on a huge piece. I put it in my notes. So if I'm on a 100-acre piece of Res 9,000, do you really care if my footprint's a little bigger? It won't affect the character of neighborhood. Nobody else will see it. And if that does meet your approval, then I would also suggest some of those bigger homes will give us some good tax dollars. So please don't negate them all. And I'm with you in scaling and size. And my 2 minutes is probably up, but I've scaled down to 1,400 square feet. Boy, am I struggling. I've already morphed into the 2nd bedroom with my office. The drawings I bring to you guys have gone in the garage. I no longer have a garage. So, and the last thing I would say, I own Northwood Village. Maybe you do or don't know. And so I modeled that after co-housing in 1988. It changed my life. And so they're all 1,100 square feet. I've got 54 families there. We're struggling. I built 12,000 square feet of heated storage. We're still struggling. There's been a bike revolution now. I'm going to build storages for bikes because everybody's got a mountain bike. You got to do it. So I've had to limit the occupancy there to 3, or I can't fit you. So one of my thoughts for you to please think about, I'm really into the cottage-style housing. If we do it, do we target seniors? Do we make it senior housing? Do we limit occupancy? Can you limit occupancy in a publicly funded project like that? Because if I build something at 1,200 square feet and it's really affordable, you're going to get families with 4 or 5 or 6 people that are going to want to take it. And I've had to, as a landlord, tell people, I'm sorry, I can't put 6 people in a 1,200 square foot unit. I love you, but you won't fit. So please think about that, because we're really trying to do a good job. I took more than my 2 minutes. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Appreciate all your work. Okay, Mike, can you give us a briefing on the proposed VCFA zoning changes?
All right, so I also handed out a stapled one that you guys should have that starts out with it says Dear City Council on the front. And if you flip to the back pages, the last 3 pages, 8, I think Donna counted out the pages, 8, 9, and 10, you'll get the VCFA maps. So page 8 is a colored map, and it really just, it lays out, to orient people, you've got the river and Berry Street running along the bottom, the neighborhood of Sabin Street, and on the top of that you start to have some of the parts of the college. And so this is property that's owned by VCFA. It's currently zoned residential 6,000, and what the college has proposed to do is to subdivide, or what they want to be able to do is to split this 18-acre parcel into 3 different zoning districts, with their proposal being that they would like to have riverfront down by Berry Street, and moving up to a middle portion that would remain residential 6,000, which they would like to permanently protect as open space. And then up behind the campus itself, they want to have mixed-use residential.
There are 2 maps here, Mike. Are they different?
So the first clean one was what was proposed. The second map, you'll notice, has just a couple of dark lines.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
The 2 dark lines that were added by me. These were my recommendations, because the other map that was provided by VCFA tends to follow contour lines, which is extremely difficult to administer.
Okay.
So my thought was this would really clean it up, make it easy for everybody, put a couple of dimensions on it, and say this would be the zoning boundaries instead. So,
Okay.
and I won't get into too much of their proposal of what they're looking at doing in the mixed-use area and on the South End area. That I'll leave for them to kind of make their case on when they're ready to make a proposal. But their thought is to do a planned unit development. They want to have that residential 6,000 area so they could transfer land, the development rights out of that. Some of that development rights would go down to the riverfront. Some of that would go up to the mixed-use residential, and they would be able to.
Bottom line for you, Mike, you think this is a reasonable proposal?
I think this is a great proposal. I would like to, certainly at some point, it would be nice to get some input from what the neighbors feel about it, but I would hope the neighbors would think this is a great idea. I certainly think it's what has been talked about for a long time.
Okay, great. Justin?
I know we have a request to consider rezoning the bottom of the Zorzi parcel as well. Do you see the lines that were proposed from the Sabins Pasture Work Group several years ago fairly consistent in terms of creating a band of riverfront property along Berry Street? Or should we be thinking about both of those things simultaneously, or one at a time?
When I received them in different orders, and I think neither one knew the other one was actually being proposed. The request from Zorzi family, we would have to adjust slightly to kind of match up those lines. It's a separate request. My thought was we should decide VCFA first, because certainly if we vote no on VCFA, it would be kind of strange to then say yes to the Sabins Pasture proposal, because they're just, part of the logic behind the riverfront for the VCFA property is that it actually abuts riverfront properties on that side of the thing. So if that gets kind of extended out, then it would make sense. If that's approved, yes, then we should have the next conversation of, okay, the Zorzi family has come in and requested that. Should we also respect their request?
Sort of best guess, the orange south end riverfront portion of this proposed map, are we talking about, what, about 3 or 4 acres, 5 acres here? How many acres of land is that at the bottom of that map?
Calculated out, I think I had it at about 3 acres. And that's just was based on non-scientific,
Sure, more or less.
yeah, more or less, looking at scaling, I think I had it as approximately 3 acres.
And without having been up there, being as intimately familiar with as I probably should with the top of this parcel, what is the how many people's view shed would turning the red portion of this map into mixed-use residential, which presumably means some amount of development there? Is that a significant, is that in a valley? I'm trying to see the topography here, and is that a ridge that's being proposed for the red mixed-use development?
I don't know how far over, it may be actually a better question for John to kind of give his thoughts on for what, because I think the next road up that way would be McKinley, and I don't know if that looks down, if it's really...
No, it's really
This
not.
definitely drops down, so people on College Street will not see this part.
It wouldn't affect any of the views from, I don't think, well, certainly not College or McKinley Street.
Yeah, it's certainly not College.
And not McKinley Street, not Arsenal Street. I don't.
Yeah.
Town Hill neighborhoods, no?
Yeah, it would be actually, I don't think it affects any, I don't think, well, maybe we should ask Jay, but I don't think there are any views from any residential areas. I think the area that would be proposed for development is right directly behind the College parking lot. So it's all,
Tends to drop
that steep
down quite a
hill.
bit.
It's quite steep there, I think,
it is quite steep there.
and then kind of flattens out several hundred feet down.
Yeah, and this will be above that flat spot, because the flat spot at the bottom is actually flood hazard area, so it's a lot of
So
this.
why is this, so I had thought the red would be, any development would be further uphill. Jay, maybe you should come up, if you don't mind, and come up, because I think we'll have questions for this, but as opposed to down along the river, is the idea that if there was development in this red section, that it would be up on the higher part towards the campus or
I
lower?
think potentially it might have been both within that area, seen as a sort of consistent relation to that, its location.
Jay,
I think
are
we
you
could-
talking to that? I can't hear you.
So you just speak up a little.
It wouldn't come as far down as the stream, but it does extend it beyond a bit what was shown previously.
What you see in red and what you see in green, even though it looks really funny, is a property line. So if you look in the green area right behind the college, that is already zoned mixed-use residential.
Oh, I see.
That
So
makes
this is
sense?
just adding this as,
Correct.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is already
so this is just adding,
just
expanding
residential
that zone?
in this area.
All right.
The abutting property, it would now then just blend in and become part of that other mixed-use property.
It's coming to a property
One-
line, not necessarily a total line.
Is his mic working? I'm not hearing him. I don't know if anyone else is, but...
That one's not, maybe you could share the other one.
One final question on this proposed red mixed-use residential. Is there any problem with an ecological overlay if there's, appears to be possibly a wetland or part of a wetland in the bottom?
There is some lower, which would have been previously looked at, but not up in the red area.
Okay. Because
Wetland lower,
map,
along the stream.
okay. And the parcel actually extends off the page here, so I'm looking at the curve to the east where it says 600 at the top center, or right at the corner.
No,
there, right?
where it says 600 is actually part of Doug Zorzi's Sabins pasture property.
That is this. So this is the end of the lot.
Correct.
Okay.
That's the line.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to get my head around what's being proposed. So right now, in the current proposed zoning, we have it all as Res 6000?
Yes.
And then the proposal is that south end riverfront, that's a higher density, and that I'm just a little bit confused, I guess. Can you?
Yes. It would make the bottom area higher density and the top area a higher density as well. In exchange, the VCFA is proposing to designate the center area as open space.
Okay. And then I understand that's the proposal now. Do we have any way of, any commitment that if we do this, that's definitely going to stay open space? I don't know what our,
Right.
I mean, we
I
don't
think there was
really-
a provision to do that. It would come along with a proposal, a specific proposal for the property. That's my understanding.
Yeah, it wouldn't be in the zoning itself. It would have to come through with the application that would come as a result of the zoning change.
So just kind of worst case scenario, if plans completely changed, what would we be looking at?
Worst case, I guess, would be that you would be at the residential 6,000 development.
Which is what we currently have in the
Which is what
proposed
it
zone.
currently is, so that wouldn't change
Okay.
from the current.
Okay.
And then the thought on the riverfront is that it would be consistent to the neighborhood to the west of it.
Right.
And continue that. And I think a number of studies have shown that it was felt that that area along Berry Street should perhaps allow a higher density, mixed use, multifamily, et cetera.
Okay, great.
Other questions regarding this proposal? Okay. Why don't we take a show of show of hands as to whether, basically, here's what we're doing. We've been going through this, through the matrix, getting a temperature. Any objections? We're not taking formal action, but I'd like to know if we've got concerns. Okay.
I'd just ask Councilor
Justin.
Hill, have you had adequate time to kind of digest this and have answered any questions that you may have on this?
Not particularly, and I apologize for my tardiness.
That's all right. We can come back to it.
Okay.
I mean, this is not a final decision, so any concerns you raise, we'll have an opportunity to come back if we need to. So I think that gives you a sense of where the council is, so.
I think Anne.
I do
Oh,
have a
Ann,
quick
yeah,
question.
sure.
I mean, I'll just tell you, I think this is a fine proposal. I guess I would wonder why we wouldn't potentially extend the riverfront portion out to the east, to the river. I mean, it kind of creates this funny little triangle between the edge of the property and that stream. And, maybe if that's also hard to enforce, then that's fine.
This is the edge of VCFA property.
And
So-
usually the edges of, districts or zones follow property lines?
Yep.
Okay, that's
And
fine.
in the same package is a request from the Zorzi family, which is talking about that continuation.
Okay,
So
so I guess
what-
I'll save that for
Yeah.
later discussion.
Yeah, but it is, I think it's timely to have that conversation now, because we're talking about creating a riverfront zone right here that ends at the Zorzi property line. And this zone, these lines that we're apparently going to support don't follow the property line. So I'm not sure why we would do it here and then not extend that same philosophy to the Zorzi property. I mean, I
Yep,
think
we
that's.
try not to. We try. Our goal. We obviously didn't do it in every single case. Was to follow property lines as much as possible, because that's much easier to administer. But certainly, if there's a very specific, like this is measured out 300 feet, 200 feet, we would have very specific proportions that we could go through. And actually, a couple of other cases that you'll see that come up. The Cedar Hill request that comes in was actually a case where we had split a larger parcel. And we'll get to that one later when we get to it. But it's another one where we had a large parcel that abutted two streets, and we put a line through the middle of it, and they come in and said, hey, we don't want a line through the middle of it. We want to be all in the one district.
So is there any reason we wouldn't just continue this over to create this riverfront district on the south end of the Zorzi property as well?
If we want to flip forward, now I'm going to wish we did have our page numbers.
I numbered mine.
It looks like
Look at page before.
it looks like this.
7.
Okay.
So I received this request separate from the VCFA request. Doug, representing his family's trust, has requested, and this does not line up with VCFA's line. That's slightly more than 300 feet. I would probably go and say we would match up to the 300-foot line if we were going to adjust this.
Or
But
vice
this
versa,
was,
yeah.
or vice versa. This was their request. It certainly changes the dynamics of how our earlier discussion was, and I don't think I need to go through and rehash that discussion of if we've got the higher density at the bottom, it's less incentive to cluster because you don't need a cluster to do what you want to do. So I won't revisit that whole discussion again, but if people have questions, we can. This was his proposal, and I wanted to make sure we had a couple of these requests that came in at the last minute, and I wanted to make sure I put it on the table for consideration.
But there would be.
I would agree with Ann that at the continuation, that makes total sense, and that's the concept, and that should continue. And I also think that there's a demand for that type of housing and something that could be different yet above that fits to with Res 6.
Justin and then Ann.
So as I kind of started out, asking some questions on this issue, I think if I'm kind of looking at a couple different overlays simultaneously to follow up on the mayor's point of considering both of these, either creation or extension of riverfront, in what's shown on this map, am I correct in that where the corner of this, where this property line bends, is that where the 600 was on the other map? Meaning that the entire suggestion for VCFA, both mixed use, 6,000, and riverfront would be roughly where it's been overlaid onto this other map?
The riverfront, I think, would be more or less an extension.
So it would come up to
correct.
the proposed
Although,
boundaries
as
of
Mike
this.
said, the dimensions may not be the same, but conceptually, yes.
Could you just interpret the colors here, the yellow hash marks and the red? What does this mean?
So the red area, apparently what Doug grabbed was our neighborhoods map, and the neighborhood map for the riverfront zoning district.
The reason
This
that
is
I'm
proposed as,
And he would like
planning
it-
commission's proposal is red, that's the red is riverfront?
Red is riverfront, that's what's in the current draft that we have, and his proposal is to add the hatched part into the riverfront zoning district.
Okay.
Part of the reason I'm wanting to get clarity on that is I'm also trying to be considerate of the Sabins Pasture Work Group proposal, which previously had identified Area A of 15 acres here as one of the proposed development areas on this parcel. And so if we're wanting the map, both of these requests to kind of match up, I'm just wanting to confirm that the riverfront district would be to the map south of what we're looking at here, not that this whole parcel is 3 different pieces. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right, so, I'm just trying to kind of overlay these
Now, to
together.
point it real quick, that's the dog leg up
Okay,
here.
okay,
So it-
perfect.
it
That's
misses
very helpful.
by,
Yep.
I don't know, 75 feet. So
Nope.
we would have to do some tweaking.
That works. I thought I was looking at the wrong dog leg there, so that's
Yeah.
very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's close, and I can certainly work with you to find out which one you want it to match to.
I would support the VCFA proposal as long as it's consistent along Berry Street as it goes out of town through the Zorzi lot.
That makes sense to me, too. Rosie?
Oh, you were.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I
Ann
guess
and then
I'm
Rosie.
just a little concerned about the disincentive to cluster if we do this. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
This goes a little bit to that chasing around that the Planning Commission spent a lot of time trying to do, and we spent some time talking about, which is if what we would like our applicants to do is to cluster and in that way leave some area protected as open space, then we have to give them an incentive to cluster. Because if we simply say you can build at a high density at the bottom, then they don't have to pull any of the development rights off the top of the hill to develop the bottom. And if they don't have to transfer any of the development rights, they don't have to protect any open space. So by zoning the bottom, and that's fine, it's completely a policy question at this point. It's how we want to.
I'd be interested in, oh, I'm sorry. Let me.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, so in their proposal, this goes to riverfront, what does the rest of it end up being?
I
Res
don't.
6?
I think his proposal would be to leave it as Res 6.
Which is what we had the whole plot at before, right?
Correct.
Yes.
If I may comment on the
But with
disincentive.
the 40% set aside
Right.
for open space, right?
once they start developing the upper field, so as long as they're developing the lower part, it wouldn't kick in that requirement. Once they get outside of that box, that riverfront box, then yes, those 40% requirements would start to kick in.
Doesn't that also only kick in if they're doing a planned unit development?
Yes, it does only kick in if there's a planned unit development, but we do have requirements where if you're doing more than 40 units in 10 years, then you're going to be forced into doing a planned unit development.
But you could have like a one-off, somebody
They could do
building.
39
They could do 39 units and
smaller lots
They-
and break up the whole thing.
Yep.
So, there's been a lot of discussion about the working group plan and this parcel, and I know, Doug, you're here. I would want to, I just want to make this offer if you want to share your thoughts about how you feel about this notion of encouraging development or allowing development along the river, but having some conservation of the land consistent with the working group proposal. I mean, do you care to share your thoughts about that? I certainly don't feel, no, I'm talking to Doug.
sorry.
Don't feel compelled to, but I thought since you're here and we've been talking about your parcel for many weeks, want to give you that
may want to talk,
opportunity.
the microphone works a little better.
Years, years.
It has been years. Spoke with Donna Bate the other night and wanted to have basically a request in maybe for November 1st in executive session to have some discussion, particularly about conservation and development. It's evident that the master plan has a desire to conserve a significant portion of the upper pasture. I think that we could work together to reach that end with another party. I'd like to have that conversation, though, in executive session.
So I think that could be a challenge. We can certainly consider it, but if it's just a discussion about policy, about zoning, I don't think we could do that. But if it involves acquisition of real estate, then that would fall, I think,
It
within the...
involves acquisition of real
Okay,
estate.
well, maybe you and I can discuss that, and we can just decide whether that's something we can bring to the council. So,
But I would like to comment on the fact of increased density along Berry Street. If you look at Berry Street, it is very compact. The zoning on the farm has always had a layered approach where compactness or clustering exists along Berry Street. What's become evident is that even if you were to zone everything riverfront along Berry Street, a large percentage of that would not be developed. You've got the railroad right away, you've got the bike path, and you've got a proposed road that's going to go up through. However, by having more density at that location to start that development is going to be a plus. There's a very significant front-end cost in crossing the brook and just getting the road started. The city desires to increase its housing base. It makes a lot of sense to do this, and I would ask that there be that type of uniform
yeah.
zoning.
Well, I think there's full support on the council for housing development or on the Berry Street parcel. I haven't heard anyone suggest otherwise. So why don't you and I, if it's amenable to you, you and I can talk and figure out the appropriate way for us to have that discussion with the city council, and then go from there?
That sounds good.
Okay. I will give
Appreciate
you a call.
it.
Great. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Just want to make a comment on the thought of disincentive if developed high density below. Been meeting with the downsized group, and I think there's a market difference. There are those who definitely would want to be in a higher density condo, multifamily, and those who still want their own individual cottage. So I think the market would respond to that, and you'd see both.
Right, yeah, which I think would be great. Rosie?
I just wanted to make a comment that I really appreciated the letter from the Zorzi family. It illustrated the challenge that we have between, property owners' rights and what do we all look at, what do we all experience? And it was a helpful reminder, and I'm not sure where I fall, but it's the thing that we're struggling with, and I really appreciated having that, so.
Hopefully, we'll find a path that
We gotta figure it out tonight,
everybody.
so.
Well, I don't think on this one we necessarily do. I think we should have some more discussion with the Zorzis.
Yeah, I think Sabin's, the pasture, planning for the future of the pasture has always been something that zoning was going to not be the way we get there. It's going to be by another tool, and certainly the development agreement is what I've always felt was the best approach to get a win for everybody. So I don't know, Mr. Zorzi hasn't spoken with me, so I don't know any of the background of it, but this is certainly the direction we would be hoping we'd get to.
Okay, so I think at this point we'll go to the matrix. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Jay.
Jay, Katie, Doug, Alan, thanks all of you. Okay, so I think we were on 120 something.
123.
123. I think we were stuck on 123, as I recall, on the issue of counting the
10 years.
10 years. Mike, do you have anything you can suggest? Or it says here we agreed to keep the 10
We
years.
agreed to keep the 10 years, and we had gotten, the last thing we did was the pre-HERS score. Remember our discussion with the pre-PV?
Okay,
HERS
so maybe we're
score,
on
which was
125 then, is that, or maybe, what, you tell me, which number are we on?
I have on my list, the next one would be 126, which we had discussed earlier, which is why it's in red. Oh, anyone who needs a new...
Yes.
Has it changed since October 4th?
It has...
Thanks, Mike.
Only in that it's been updated.
The colors in the end. It will help when we get to the end. I'll get back on the microphone here. What happened at the end is I've color-coded them back, so there's a number of them that we're not going to have to look at because I've gone through to say, this has already been talked about, number 25, this has already been talked about, number 37, so we can skip through when we get to the end much faster.
Okay, so on 126, does anyone have any additional comments? We have spent a lot of time discussing this issue of 40% versus 5% comments regarding that.
I couldn't remember where we ended up in terms of whether the undevelopable, whether it was slope or whatever, whether that counted towards the 40%. And I guess where I am right now is I think that undevelopable probably should count towards that 40%.
I think it does count, but it was a lower, it tiered which ones you had to protect first. You had to protect the natural resource inventory items first, and the undevelopable land, and then the official map.
So we're never going to be requiring that they set aside more than 40%.
Yeah, that was a cap. And this has been sent, so this 3404J has been sent to the city attorney for review because his concern was you can't set things at a fixed amount. And before we had a range from 5% to 40%, we raised minimum to 40%, so now it's a minimum and a maximum of 40%. I think that's going to be a problem, but I shipped it off to him to see what his recommendation is. So
Okay, so we may come back to
this
that
one we will have to come back to.
Can we also just get a brief update on where the official map of natural resources, John Anderson's map, has that been finalized and is it available for review?
No, the official map is not. It hasn't been getting enough attention to be.
I would just say that if we're being asked to consider, Section 2 here, that's specifically referencing a map that we don't have, that could be somewhat challenging.
I believe the wording of it says that an official map, if so adopted. Because if we don't put it in and then adopt the official map, then we'd have to amend the zoning to make it applicable.
But from a policy standpoint, if the intention is, and there is one that's being developed, and it is to adopt one, it would be nice to know what that is as we're adopting the bylaws.
That would be agreed.
Would it be possible to see a draft? Or is
I don't think John Anderson was working on it, and I don't think we have a draft of that yet. It's one that we'll have to follow up and see what the status is.
I would just propose that if it comes back that we can't do minimum and maximum of 40%, that the min be 30 and the max be 40, somewhere there. I don't know how other people feel about that, but
I'd like to wait and just see
Yeah,
what the
that's fine.
legal analysis is before we make a respond to it, because we don't know what
it's fair.
the legal.
My first blush is a much lower percentage and allow property owners to do as they please with their parcel. Closer, a range is fine, but closer to what it is now.
All right, so we're going to have to come back to this, so let's move on. 127, I think, is just well, I'm going to skip that unless anybody thinks we need to.
Yeah, I think that one can be kind of
It
skipped
goes
over
without
unless somebody has a
saying.
question on it.
128, concern that a developer could cover the entire open space with solar panels.
Oh, that was mine.
3404J4.
So on this one, we said that they had to set aside some open space, but then we allowed them to use a variety of uses, and one of the uses was for renewable energy production. And the concern was that you make money off renewable energy production, so why would a developer do anything but that with the open space? And we were hoping for a variety of uses there. So my suggestion might be that we allow them to do up to a percentage as renewable energy production, but stick a limit on that use. I don't know what other folks think, but
I would not be into limiting the amount of renewable production.
I would, limiting the area, obviously, not the amount of.
Nope,
Yeah, I guess I
would
don't,
not be into
are there
limiting it.
restrictions on solar farms in terms of safety that they need to be fenced?
Yeah, they do need to be fenced.
So it's not really,
There's already a limit on the number of kilowatts that you can put in a parcel.
so I guess when I think of open space, I don't think of a fenced-in area full of solar panels, anecdotally. I would be in favor of considering removal as well, or limiting a percentage.
I'm just thinking in terms of Sabins or another large development type thing that we've thought about theoretically. And I'm not saying that they would do this, but theoretically, we could figure out some kind of thing that says that they will set aside a certain amount of space, but then that could all get turned into solar panels and not be available for natural resources or for the folks living there to use as recreation or anything like that. So, like Justin's saying.
It's conceivable that if you put a percentage limit on it, then you might end up limiting it to be, less than the 150 kilowatt maximum, and that's going to throw a wrench in. I mean, if that is somebody's plan, then they want to do that on that site. I would think that we would want to get the most out of that. If you're going to dedicate a piece of property to, substantial amount of solar, you don't want it to be any less than 100. You wouldn't want to artificially limit it to less than 150 kilowatts.
Ashley?
For me, one of the concerns, though, is that can be a profit generator for people, and I would hate to think that we didn't address this as a matter of public policy before we, adopt the zoning, and then sort of are in this place where all of a sudden, some of our open spaces are being turned into profit generation rather than things for everyone.
I hadn't really thought about this, but, Sabins Pasture is an example. If you have a 40% set aside, that hillside faces south. You could have that entire hillside covered with solar panels, which would be,
I think the key is
that 40%.
we're trying to encourage a variety. I'm sorry for speaking over.
Yeah, no, that's.
But we're trying to encourage a variety of uses through this. And so I'm certainly not opposed to some of it being solar. But because that one has more of a financial incentive, I'm worried that if we don't limit it to some extent, then all of the open space in every development will be turned into solar.
Well, it's not, I wouldn't view it as open space. It's not, it's a use, it's a great use, but it's not what we consider open space.
Well, and I'm saying there's already a state limit, which is 150 kilowatts, which is a certain amount of area. So there are already going to be limits on that.
But how big is 100? And what sort of array would that be?
I could look that up for you. It's like a standard.
I think it's
sort of
also,
size.
it's kind of, even if it's not the entire amount of open space, it's, I think about District 3 on Pleasant View Street and that whole side of town is looking across, using Sabins as an example, and even if you just had a big white rectangular belt of industrial power generation, albeit renewable, it certainly changes, from my perspective, sort of the meaning of open space and what the intent of this is.
Donna?
But the open space and solar panels, solar panels don't have to stay where they are. There are places that raise the solar panels so you actually have the space underneath that's positive for gardens. It gives partial shade. It's a matter of whether you have fixed or rotating. So I think we have to be careful about assuming just what we have today, as well as I think there are finite amounts of allowability in any field. So.
Jean and then Ashley.
I was wondering if we have local design review or some other conditions that affect siting of solar panels.
Certainly, if it was an application for solar panels, we would have to look through how it all lays out in here, because there are some state exemptions, so there's a good chance it would probably be exempt from zoning because it's hooked into the grid. It'll need a certificate of public good.
I don't think the state regulates the siting.
But it's a dynamic process because state laws, a number of communities, Addison County folks that want to change state law to allow local municipalities to regulate. So we may, in the future, have the right to regulate it. But if it's
I think Ashley and then Ann.
I guess I would be curious to see how other municipalities have handled this issue. I mean, I can't imagine that we're the first one to think about this and to raise this as a concern. And I certainly agree with Ann that, we should encourage renewable energy generation, but also being mindful of the fact that this was designed to provide people with an actual space to go or to look at or something. And certainly, Donna's suggestion is apropos and well taken, but what I don't want to end up with is a situation where, we haven't thought this particular piece through, and then all of a sudden there goes an array that we didn't intend to have happen. So I'd be curious to see how other municipalities have handled this, and I wouldn't even know where to start, but I can't imagine that it's never come up.
I like what Jean was saying about, having maybe, I'm not sure if I heard you quite correctly, but something about including a design review process for that. Because I would also, in Sabins Pasture, I think that would probably not be the best use of that land, even though it is facing south. But, I think of our current array on Log Road, which is on what could be considered open space now, but it's so hidden and no one ever goes there that if this rule was, let's say that space was, somehow subject to this rule, if that would have been possible based on this, this proposal. And the other thing to note is that, so I did, quick search, 150 kilowatts is 1.5 acres, roughly.
So just to note that I think that wouldn't apply to something like the Log Road site because this is only the open space that somebody would set aside as part of a PUD. So if you're going to do a PUD so that you get that increased density, we want to make sure that that's all it would apply to.
And perhaps, but I mean, it could have been. I guess my point is not necessarily that site particularly, what I mean is not necessarily that development, but let's say it was in that location, but a PUD, you know what I mean? Because it's so out of the way, would anybody have cared? Plus, I think if we want to encourage, net zero housing, I would think that we would want people to at least, put in a portion of solar to cover that. So anyway, I think it maybe warrants some further thought.
Mike, can you give that a little thought and come back to us with some thoughts? I'm not sure we're giving you direction, but I think the concern is under this, all of the open space could be taken by renewable energy.
Yeah, so if we look, this is coming in under J4, and so what I may suggest or what I may look at doing is adding a sub-A that may go and say something to the effect of
subject to.
just making sure that there's a balance of, or maybe used for conservation, agriculture, silviculture, renewable energy, and/or passive recreation, in accordance with terms of any easement or condition of approval. I mean, technically, in some sense, the DRB already has the power, as that's written, to go through and apply conditions. I guess I can try to come up with something that would.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
If you
what
want
the-
it specific to address renewable energy, I can just go through and put a phrase in there to ensure that
I think that's the concern, at least mine.
a
that
balance
all-
of uses, or
That all of the yeah, sorry.
And I just threw out the percentage that there is a way of, that would be one way of dealing with that, but I'm totally open to other ways of handling that. I just.
Okay, and maybe, as Ashley suggested, look at other jurisdictions if that's possible.
I don't think we'll find much, but I'll take a
Yeah,
look.
probably not. That's probably true. Okay. All right, so moving on, 129 is just a question, 130 is a typo, 131
Much a typo.
seems like a typo. Stop me, anybody, if they want to talk about any of those. And 132 is the next substantive one. Allowable size and height of main entrance signs seems large. Make smaller and allow DRB to make larger.
34. So these are specific to the campus PUD, 3406K.
As a point of clarity, that we're talking about VCFA and National Life, are there other campus developments that we should be considering as we consider this set of rules?
No, not that I'm aware of. It certainly could come up for some others. It's designed to be more generic than the old AI PUD, which was designed just for academic institutions. So this is kind of designed that somebody could put in an industrial park or something else and follow the same types of rules. So the rules here say an entrance sign not more than 64 square feet or 20 feet in height. And so the comment here was that that's awfully big and awfully tall. And I agree, that is awfully big and awfully tall. So the ground-mounted signs are currently proposed in other parts of town with a maximum of 32 square feet and 12 feet high, so that would sound like a better default. Staff recommends changing to 32 and 12 with a new statement at the end that the DRB may approve waivers to that standard not to exceed 100% in size and 50% in height, provided additional size will not negatively affect the character of the area.
Agree.
Pretty good with that?
Yes.
Okay, 133.
So, all right, just wanted to reread that to double
Yeah,
check
sure.
I
I
had that
think we
right.
all need a minute
So,
to digest that.
So 3503, we are talking about subdivision regulations, and we're talking about the suitability of the land for a subdivision. And the recommendation here was there's a letter A, there's a letter B, and somebody recommended a letter C. Actually, it wouldn't be a number 3.
Yeah, it's not in the current proposal, it's an addition.
This was a recommended addition. Buildings and building envelopes on recorded plats shall be representative only and placed only to demonstrate the suitability of an area for development, approval of a plat with a house. So we get a number of times when people come in with a subdivision plat, they will draw in a building envelope and say, hey, this is where I'm going to put a house. In some cases, they actually draw the outline of the house on it. And we had an actual case last, summer, so only 3 or 4 months ago, where somebody put the house on their plat, and then they wanted to build their house, except they wanted to move it 5 feet to the left. It was still met all the setbacks, still met everything, but they had to go through a revision of their plat, which meant sketch plan, preliminary plan, final plan approval of the plat before they could apply to build their house because they had drawn a picture of their house on the plat. And it becomes law at that point. And so we just wanted to put in here just a qualifier that says if somebody puts something like that on their plat, it's just representative only and not binding.
Makes sense.
Agree.
No concerns? Okay. 134.
Would need a traffic study. So the comment was that everything would need a traffic study, but this requirement here for subdivisions was only subdivisions resulting in 75 trips a day would need a professional study. 75 trips is actually a fairly big project. I know when Sibley project was proposed, that was 16 residential units, which was not big enough to trigger a 75-trip study. So 75 trips is what you'd have to reach to trigger the requirement of a traffic study, and that generally would have to be a decent-sized project. And if somebody's doing a project that size, they should do a traffic study.
Do you have any objection to including that specific trigger of 75 trips per day in Section 3504C in terms of mitigation measures, just to make it clear to people who are looking at traffic resulting in the last sentence? So I'm at the top of page 3123.
At the bottom of the previous page, traffic impact study.
I got it. I see it now.
Yeah, it has the 75 new trips.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Okay, any objections and concerns? Okay. Let's see, where are we? Thanks, Alan. Okay, 135.
So 135, I've worked with Tom. It's in your punch list. I don't know if we wanted to save the punch list for later. We'll come back and get to that one.
Either, I guess, I don't know, whichever you'd prefer. Come back to it?
Either way, it's because that actually appears in two places. That's conditional use and here. So, I mean, we'll have to discuss it at some point.
Okay, well, we can wait and just go through the separate list.
All right, so that's saved.
136, Section 3,
So that was just a simple recommendation to add a requirement that all new lots shall have sufficient buildable area. It's a common sense thing, but it really wasn't here, so put it in.
Okay, all good. Let's see,
Typo
typos on
and
the next
previously
two.
discussed.
139.
That was our previous discussion. It appears twice in the thing about how to measure a quarter-mile walk.
Did we, I can't recall, did we resolve that?
We
at the last
resolved how
one?
to make a quarter-mile walk, and in fact, our quarter-mile walk became a half-mile walk.
Okay, so we did it there, then we.
Anyone else want to push it? And
All right,
Spent enough time on that.
that's where we are, all right. Okay.
40 pedestrian.
40.
Again, this orange one is on my punch list. I put it on the punch list, so we can hold this one for 140, unless people want to talk about it right now.
Briefly, do you support that, or do you not support that?
Yes, I drafted some, I think we should add a 3A, and the staff will develop some language for council to consider, and so I've developed some language that basically says, which is the last part of my punch list on the back page.
Okay.
Applicants shall provide travel ways for bicycles in conformance with the Vermont Pedestrian and Bicycle Facility Planning and Design Manual for smaller subdivisions and private roads. This will involve safely integrating bicycles into shared roadways.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Well, I wouldn't want to limit it to shared roadways. I mean, that's just markings on a street, which doesn't mean that they're accommodating biking. I see shadows as sort of a retroactive way of creating a bike environment. If somebody's building a new subdivision, they should be able to, I mean, you're not going to make a subdivision bike-friendly by creating a traditional road and then putting street markings, I mean, shadow markings on it.
Yeah, in some cases, actually, the shared road markings are what's requested. If it's a low traffic volume road, then it would be, it basically, the manual goes through these levels of, if it's less than 50 vehicles a day, then it's a shared road because there isn't enough traffic to warrant putting in a bike lane, and then it moves up to wide shoulders and bike
So
lanes.
why the reference just to Sharrows then?
We could take the second line right out and just reference the bike manual.
Well, as I understand this, I think a couple key parts of this are the word explicitly, so that my thought is just that, not that it's trying to discourage having designated multi-use recreational paths, i.e. bike lanes, but that people with rollerblades or it could be for a variety of uses,
sure.
and if people want a designated explicit, high-speed bicycle lane to go in, then maybe that's where we would shift them onto the shared space with the cars.
Yeah, and I'm fine with shared bike lanes. I just don't want us to pin us down. I want to create a broad policy that encourages a
More
bike
than
and
willing to take
pedestrian-friendly
that second sentence
transportation.
out.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, more than willing to take that second sentence out and just leave it that people have to meet the pedestrian and design manual, which is really, it's a really expansive and, very detailed about what
Okay.
you should do.
Everybody all right
Places
with
we
that?
have bike lanes, we have sidewalks too, right? Or no?
Again, it kind of factors into what the road type is. So usually private roads and residential roads are pretty easy to define as people walk on the roads and they bike on the roads. And as you get more traffic, it warrants having a sidewalk on one side and eventually warrants having a sidewalk on both sides.
So it's fair to say there's places where we have just roads and as shared bike lane, share-o roads, or sidewalks and roads, or roads and bike lanes and sidewalks. So we have a mix of all those things.
And you'll see when we get to the SCBC, this grant that we have to do the street types, this just kind of basically falls right into that. And eventually, once we get the street typology done, we'd probably go back and amend this to go and reference the street typology to go and say, you'll have to meet the appropriate street typology for what you're building. And you'd have to meet that requirement.
Don?
That was my question, is where that fell in with the bike design, since we're getting that done.
Yeah, it definitely would.
It's an amendment after the fact?
Yeah, we would probably go through and amend. Once we see what the street typologies are, we'll see how best to write the rules to kind of integrate those, because that's certainly the direction we should go.
Okay, comment 141, we did discuss this in the context of a previous comment. Well, this is the character of the neighborhood question where we struck a sentence, and I think
3304.
does the same sentence apply here? Let's see this.
I didn't even catch that one, sorry.
Yeah, so it's the same issue, so I think, it seems to me, we struck a sentence in section 3304, that same sentence is in 3507, so it seems to me we'd strike it again.
Yes. Scene number 112, and that's what I will put there.
All right, we're all good with that? Okay, typo, let's see, 143 and 144 blank on mine, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, 146, okay, part
All right,
4.
part four. Part four, we've now gotten out of the rules, we're now into those process questions.
Okay.
That one was mine. I don't love it, but I'm happy to, I understand the logic, and we can move on from that. I wish that there was a way to provide people with...
We are working very hard right now to have an integrated office downstairs. We are now doing the applications for DPW, so we're working in that direction. So we'd rather not have it kind of in here as a requirement. It should be a requirement on me, and it should be a requirement on my department, but it shouldn't necessarily be written into the ordinance.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so if there's no objection, we'll move to 147. Should we provide a definition of promptly under 4201H?
I think this one was mine as well. I just guess I wonder what our recourse is if, for some reason, the committees were not promptly, what's this committee?
Yeah, there are a lot of cases where there are requirements under state law.
Okay.
It goes and says this, it says this. There's some that don't have deadlines. We have a 30-day requirement to issue permits. We usually issue them in a day. So a couple of these where there aren't necessarily requirements, we don't usually add them in as a requirement. It just gives any fluky thing could happen that puts us in a position
You're
where
right,
we
sorry,
may end up in a
I was
deemed
thinking this
approved.
was committees, but it's the administrative officer,
Yeah.
so I'm happy to move on from that one, too.
It requires
This is
applicants.
just a really minor one, but actually, I'll raise this with you separate. It's a drafting style issue.
Word two. Is it there?
Huh?
The word there?
No, it's, well, I'll go ahead and raise it now. It's changing the word must. This uses the word, we use the word must for, like, so in 4201H, the administrator or officer must. The appropriate way to do in drafting would be shall.
Yep.
And you and I talked about that.
I agree
Are
with
you
you.
going to change all those? Is there,
I can do a global search replace and then
so I guess I
proofread
should
everything.
raise this. This is, but it's just not, I mean, in style, for legislative drafting, you don't use the word must. You'd use the word shall if it's something that's required, and
Yes, this-
may if it's
This
permissive.
was my consultant's preferred way to do things, and we picked the battles that we were going to go for, and it's legal to do it, saying must and will, but convention is that you would use the word shall.
Right.
So,
All right, so if there are any objections to doing a
Place.
search and replace, this, okay. Okay,
so was that a vote to make that change?
I think so.
Okay.
I didn't hear any objections to it. I didn't hear any
It's
objections.
important to John, so.
Well, it wasn't, I actually wasn't going to raise it because I thought it was a waste of everybody's time, but I
I
didn't want to
actually
be
think
presumptuous.
it
to-
does appear somewhere when we get to section 5, so I may,
Is it a huge amount of
yes,
time,
it
Mike?
actually is 165, so
We're done.
I'll say 165 is already done.
Okay, defining, are we still on 4201? What did we decide about promptly? We were going
Shall.
to leave that?
I said it was fine.
Then move on, all right. 148, 4207D.
So there was a question about the deemed approval. I believe this is going to 4207 is a certificate of compliance. Oh, again, but it does go back to the deemed approval. So there's a lot of case law, a lot of stuff that runs around. I'll give my non-legal opinion of where things generally fall out. Deemed approval's a funny thing because if we don't issue a permit within 30 days, what the legislature wanted was that if we aren't doing our job and we don't get the permit out in 30 days, it's deemed approved. And then, of course, nobody ever thought about, well, how does that actually function in the real world? Do you appeal to the DRB? Do you just get to work without a permit? Officially, according to the courts, the deemed approved, we need some kind of paper trail. Maybe somebody dropped off a zoning application at the fire department. But the proper place to do the remedy is through Superior Court. And
This was mine. I think I raised this. I think
think you did.
it defeats the purpose of this requirement if somebody has to hire a lawyer and go to court to obtain a right that they've already, that they're guaranteed. That is, the permit's supposed to be, if it's deemed approved, it's deemed approved, and they should be able to, I think, go do whatever they're going to do.
it's not the way the courts have handled it.
So how have they? I mean, if it's
They
deemed approved,
require
what-
them, they require somebody, if they believe you are entitled to a deemed approved, that you would go to court and make your case, and the court would hear the evidence. Part of this has to do with them, first of all, demonstrating that they actually did submit an application, prove you actually submitted an application that it wasn't responded to, because you're getting a very big gift
Right.
by not having to meet any of the regulations. The second piece is it gives the abutters. So the example I used in here is, imagine Doug Zorzi comes in and turns in an application to put in 500 units in Sabin's pasture. We drop the ball, and we say, oh, well, Doug's 500 units is deemed approved. I guess he can go forward. And all the neighbors say, whoa, 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 hold on. Where's our opportunity? We just lost our rights because the city screwed up. Where's our opportunity to comment? Their opportunity would come at Superior Court.
I was just reading actually from DRM about this issue, and then it says that you have to go to the court to get that final sign off.
What's DR?
Downs, Racklin, Martin.
Oh, my firm.
Well, they say so.
Oh, I trust that. That's got to be right then. Where did you say? Well, I'm just curious.
I just happened to
And it
Google,
just shows up
and,
as
and that was just one of the
DRM.
results that came up.
right.
Does a town's delay in issuing a decision mean the zoning permit is deemed approved? And then it sort of talks a little bit about the statutory intent, talks about Act 250, and it also goes on to say that unfortunately the remedy of deemed approval is not commonly granted. So you go to the court to get
you
that,
go.
and then
Your research must be done really quick. I'm impressed.
Oh, if only. The remedy is applied conservatively because its improper application can operate to grant permits wholly at odds with the zoning ordinance. So,
Okay, well, far be it for me to challenge DRM legal advice.
Mike, how would you interpret if the administrative officer does not act? What does that mean? Just to say that we've received your application would be to act, would it not?
The zoning administrator is required, when it says a zoning administrator is required to act, they must approve, deny, or refer to a review panel. So we could receive an application, send it to the state for comment with flood hazard rules. If it takes them 45 days, that the clock stops the minute we send it to the state. And then when it returns, their clock starts again. So we have 30 days to issue a decision. Again, we never take that long. We're always, unless somebody's on vacation, these applications come in and go back out.
So I guess I would, coming back to your first two statements, the first is that if someone just claimed to file an application but didn't, wouldn't they need to show that they actually, to even come and pursue that application, wouldn't they need to have a copy of something that you gave them in their hand?
They end up having a high burden to prove when they get to court, but it's their legal right.
Even if they didn't go to court, if we did consider not making them go to court to actually...
It's not our choice. This is under state law. This is literally nothing that we have any say in.
And often when it goes to court, then they don't get it approved.
And that's a decision for the courts.
Sure.
And how they've done it. Legislatively, the legislature wanted these to be issued. The courts have decided how this is going to work.
I just sent that to everyone.
Thank you. Okay. All right, we ready to move on? 150, Conservation Commission review.
I think this was mine as well, and I understand the explanation, and I'm happy to accept it.
Okay, if there's no objection, we'll move on. 151.
4501. All right, we're now to notices, hearings, and procedures. States at least one more when state law requires at least two more. Agreed, so it's actually a drafting error. That's more of a typo. Absolutely should say at least two more.
Okay, we're all set with that one then. 152, 405H, or 4505H.
4505H. So we're talking about how to issue a decision, and this tends to run in the Development Review Board must send a copy of the decision to the applicant, and all others who participated in the hearing must file a copy of the decision with the administrative officer and record its decision in the land records. So by running those into a big long sentence with a lot of commas, it looks confusing, and it is confusing. So it really could just very easily be said, the DRB must, (1), send a copy to the applicants and others.
Okay,
2,
I think we're good. That's just a drafting. If anybody, stop me if I'm going too fast, jump in, but we'll go on 153, 4505L.
4505L. It's a weird place for something that just says DRB approvals and related conditions will run with the land they remain in with respect. It really doesn't belong where it's written, so I would strike it.
Okay. All right.
Do you know where it should be? Should it be somewhere? Sorry.
Good question. Is that a matter of state law?
It's a matter. I think it's a matter of. It just is. We can state it somewhere.
Right. I think that's just a matter of real estate laws. Permits run with the land.
Yeah, I think if I were going to do it, I would put it all the way back in Part 1 under the general things, just to go and say permits run with the land. But I think
okay.
it's good.
154.
Figure 4.2 had 3 sets of comments. So this was our mystery table that we had that had no information in it because 3 times we've tried to fix it,
right,
and 3 times we've ended up with nothing in the boxes. So,
right.
check boxes.
Can you
Staff
just
recommendation would be
give
to
us a
remove the
second to
table and-
digest this? I'm going to read your comments here.
So these were 3 comments that were received related to this.
You gave us a new page on that one, didn't you? Is that the 402 figure?
Yeah, that's the
You gave us a
40
new page
Page
on that one.
4-21, I think.
Yeah, 4-21's the page.
I've got pencil checks in here.
You gave us
You
an
have
extra-
them in your,
Did you
You
hand
gave us-
something out
you gave us
that
a new
filled
page.
this in?
I did give you a new one so you
Here it is.
guys knew which ones. Yes, I did give you one so you guys would know what they are.
Thought I'd see, okay.
In response to what we had for comments, I went through, there are a couple of ways we could do this. One would be to remove this table altogether and then insert the requirements into the sections. So rather than put them into a table, take them out of the table. But that's one suggestion. The second comment somebody had was that it talks about character of the area, and or district, and should it say character of the area or neighborhood? And third,
it's number 4, is that right? Area
these
or
don't
district?
appear in state law, so
Proposed land development will not hurt the character.
staff would recommend would be to remove the table, insert per state law the requirements of 4603.d1 and 2, and the requirements for general variances and renewable variances. Insert requirements into 4602C. So the thought was, get rid of the table altogether, take these things out, and put them in just in text format,
Substantively, where they belong.
substantively, match state law where it's required to be state law, because general variances and renewable energy variances, those requirements are set in state law. What's here is not word for word in state law, and somebody, I think it may have been Paul Gillies pointed that out, and so it's, yeah, we've got to match state law. We don't have any wiggle room in what a variance is.
Well, can you change, I find the chart helpful to see it all there. Is there a way to change it so it states state law?
I
just find it
could
helpful.
amend this. Yeah, I could certainly go through, if your vote was to say, keep the table, but fix the state law and fix the waiver requirements,
That's
I could
what
do
I
that.
would prefer. I found it helpful to find it all in one place instead of scattered. But
I would agree with that as
Any
well.
objection to that?
Keep the table,
Keep the table and
But to make the other
fill it
amendments.
in? Okay.
Yes.
Before we move off that one, are you in number 4 in the criteria descriptions? Had you considered adding or substituting the word neighborhood in there? Or is that already done?
That was the second comment. Should there be, I think the word district should be replaced with neighborhood. But except for waivers, these rules are set by state law and should match. So we would have to make sure that the requirement for variances is as stated in state law.
So
So
could
if
we
state
add
law
the
says
word
character of
neighborhood?
the area, then it's character of the area regardless of whether we would like that to be neighborhood.
Right. So could we add the word neighborhood after district? So area, comma, district, comma, or neighborhood? That way we would...
When it applies to waivers, yes. How it applies to variances for general variances and renewable energy variances, that's under state law.
So no, not for that column, but yes for waiver.
Yes, neighborhoods for, character of neighborhoods for waiver. So- And I'll see how it's worded exactly for the state law and see if there's room in there to make that, but I'm pretty sure it says character of the area.
Okay, we're all good with that? Okay, the next two, I think, are typos, or
That's a typo.
Crafting.
City shall observe any limitations for it.
57,
Yep.
confusion, all right, let's see. Well, 4701G, confusion.
All right, 4701. We are talking about investigations and actions by the administrative officer regarding enforcement procedures. Point G is talking about the administrative officer must not enforce any violation of a zoning permit that was not filed in the city's land records. And I heard from a number of people that this was confusing. And I think technically this can be deleted as it was part of the limitations that are talked about in point F above. So the point F says, we shall observe any limitations of enforcement. What state law says is that if a permit is issued but not recorded in the land records, that the city cannot enforce zoning violations on that property. So we issue a permit to build a garage 10 feet from the property line. You build it 5 feet from the property line. We would be unable to enforce that violation if the permit, if the permit is not recorded.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the permit doesn't get recorded. That's a problem for any number of reasons, but
Yeah, it is what it is. We're stuck with what state law says, but really what it was trying to do is to protect purchasers of properties.
Right.
So if you purchase a property, you hire a title attorney who goes through, does title work, goes and says everything's good and clean, you get done, you buy the property, and then the city comes in and says, oh, by the way, that's a violation. Well, what the state wanted to say is, nope. If you didn't do your job and properly record the violations and properly record the permits, you can't go back afterwards. So
Okay, so we're all set with this one?
Are we deleting
I would
that?
strike point
Yeah.
G because I think it's already in point F.
And I like that, because, I like striking it in the point F, because point F has the reference to the state law, and if state law changed, then we would automatically
Right.
be dealing with that rather than.
Okay, 158, restorative justice.
We've tried to tackle this in a number of ordinances, and I think this has come up with you guys as well. I think this one, we may want to wait till we can put the time and effort to make sure because it's, under state law, the administrator is required to literally enforce the bylaws and to enforce it. They don't have a choice. And so I think we would have to really spend some time working with our attorney if we wanted to try to cut out a room to do restorative justice option, because just the way zoning is unique. And it says this is the way things are done.
Ann?
I could picture asking the Community Justice Center to take a look at this for some future iteration of the zoning or, an amendment, if they have some suggestions. Because, if we're going to, want there to be a restorative option, it sounds like it needs to be allowed for in the bylaws, and that if that requires more, I guess I'm just agreeing that maybe we keep it for now, but I'd love to get their input on it for some future time.
That's what I would do. I would wait. I think it's something we should address, but I don't think it's something that we can do right now.
Ashley, you're on the committee now,
Yes.
right? Is that something you can take
Sure.
to them? Cool.
yes.
Okay, good to move on. Item 159.
I think
Informational.
159 was mine, and I understand Mike's explanation, so that's fine.
You're good with that? Informational question, okay. 160.
May should be replaced with a shall. That's basically a typo. You don't have a choice.
Okay.
May issue as no
So
zoning
that's
violation.
good, unless anybody objects. Go on to
This one, 165, we just did, replace with shall.
Okay, 166. That was my
So
I would
I agree
actually
with that.
just suggest that we say his, her, their.
There's there.
It's fine with me. Unless
For
there,
any reason,
unless
you
there's
would
a
do there.
legal reason.
Like
Yep.
just there.
Sure.
Yep.
If people choose their,
Not to be
There is their
gender
pronoun.
specific.
Non-binary.
EIR.
We all-
binary, yes.
We're all there, right?
Not necessarily, but you could.
You
It
could
just isn't
Could
as
be.
specific.
well, that
We're
assumes
referring
that.
to the their EIR.
Right.
Yes.
There. Okay.
Right.
That's fine.
You
My
don't get
brain-
into gender at all.
I'm sitting trying to spin things to make sure I got
First
the right
person
one.
possessor.
Well, I guess then,
Heirs.
I would just say,
Right.
is there a way to just take all that and use some gender-neutral pronoun? I don't know if we had, do we, is there, or
Just
just
use
drafted
there,
or is
be
it,
used
or
there.
there?
For the most part, usually you should never have a pronoun in
Right.
a regulation. That's another generic rule. There you go. another lesson. You should never have pronouns in regulations. You should always
Right.
go in, so it should say the applicant or something along
Okay,
those lines.
so can you just fix that? Take out all the
Yep.
gender-specific pronouns? Okay, 167. Oh, that's one of my stupid ones, too. All right, is that, I'm fine with that. I think that was mine.
Does that make sense for
Yep,
most people?
that's fine
I
with me.
was surprised how many times it actually was in there for and/or.
So each time it's replaced, it's a decision to make as to whether it should be and or, right? They're two different words with
Well, I
different
think you'd
meanings.
have a default, but with this or, but proofing it to make sure it's appropriate. So you'd have to read it to make sure it's not inappropriate.
Okay, so the default change will be or.
Yeah, I think for the most part, when I look through this, it's one of these ones, you have to do this or this, and I don't think
Both.
anyone ever
And
goes and
means
assumes,
both.
yeah.
So they're
If
two
you do
different.
both, you've done one or the other, so you can put or in. You just have to be careful. It's usually it's not saying you can have cookies or ice cream, it's saying, you know,
But there's a difference between saying there you can have cookies or ice cream or cookies and ice cream.
yes, but
They're two different
usually
things.
And is way
usually we're
better
making
there.
Yeah,
requirements.
exactly.
Usually we're writing requirements, so usually if somebody has to do A or B, and if they do both, we're happy.
Okay.
All right, so I think this is a drafting one that I think
We'll
you guys can
carefully, I'll
figure
try to
that out.
carefully go through and do that. And if I
Okay.
have any questions, I'll highlight them and bring them back.
168, 5101. Generally.
This is just definitions.
I guess for this one, I would fall on the side of wanting to make it as easy as possible for the reader. So if the reader is having to stop and go reference state law every 2 minutes, I don't like that. But if we're just talking about a couple of places where, I don't know.
Maybe one way to deal with the potential conflict with state law is to say that these definitions apply unless there's a different definition. Well, actually, I don't know. I think there is a legitimate concern that they could conflict with state law, and then what does apply, so.
All right, so remember above when we had these discussions in 5001.d where we define will and must and, you know, we could go and put in a clarifying one up there in interpretations that add one that says where state law is referenced. I don't know, I'll have to
Well,
come
I
up with
guess the
something. I
question
think you know where I'm going with it, where state law is referenced.
I
and
guess
state law
there's a
changes.
question. If we want to say that if there's a conflict in a definition between our ordinance and state law applies? Or do we want to say the municipal ordinance applies? We probably can't do that, but that's,
It's tough because sometimes we have the flexibility to change state law definitions,
but then
and
some they
sometimes we
might,
don't.
so, I don't know. Maybe we just leave it.
Is it safe to say that generally state law is going to be more permissive than our municipal proposed zoning bylaws? Generally.
I think it depends. State law establishes floors and ceilings. You must, at a minimum, do this, and at a maximum, you can't go beyond this. So depending on whether they're trying to establish a minimum, we can be more, and if it's a maximum, we can do less. So there isn't a definite always this or always that. It really depends whether it's
Rosie
floor or
and
ceiling.
then Ann.
Can we do what you're suggesting in terms of, saying when there's a conflict and then go on to say when allowable, the zoning applies, which then, the extension is that when it's not allowable, the state law would apply when it's in conflict.
Doug?
Well, I mean, Michael, is it a habit that cities regularly change their zoning in relationship to state law? I mean, it's
will.
changing all the time.
They will. Sometimes it makes a difference, sometimes it doesn't. When the state law changes, sometimes it doesn't affect your regulations. Sometimes it does. But it's certainly, as somebody who worked a lot with flood hazard rules, we used to get regulations all the time that would say, well, it just has to be in compliance with 47 CFR 6037. And we're all sitting here saying, I've got to go and look at the Federal Register circular to go and determine what my requirements are as a zoning administrator. Why don't they just reprint them into the regulations?
Well, likewise, we're sort of asking our consumers to go check the state law.
Yeah, and then if you're an applicant, the applicant would have to go and look that up to know what they would be applying for. So it's.
There's no way
I would
around it.
usually put it into the regulations. Would be my default, and if state law changes, we come back and go and say we had to amend this definition.
Will this document be online on the city website?
Yes. Oh yeah.
So if there's a link to the statutes, would our document be automatically updated? So if folks did their research, if there were some kind of blanket statement in the printed document that said, for the most current version, go to the online document and it will link to the most current state statute, could there be something as simple as that, or is that just dreaming?
I would have to think about how that would work, because I don't think we could do that. I'm juggling because you guys are going to officially adopt the zoning, which includes the definitions, and to go and say, yeah, except that it changes. But I do know we do that periodically, to go and say, we're going to reference the most recent flood hazard map. So if the federal government updates the flood hazard map, our regulations change because they've updated the flood hazard map. Or some communities will reference the ANR Atlas regarding wetlands. So if the ANR Atlas changes, what's getting regulated changes. So I'm trying to balance that with usually the text parts. I haven't seen that happen, but
So,
I think it would have to be in the interpretations. If we could finagle some word to make it go and say in the interpretation section, it says where state law changes, state law shall override.
So, Jean, that was totally my thought as well. I mean, in my ideal version of this document, anytime it says, VSA, 4701 or whatever it is, right, that there's a link there, so that people can pretty easily, if they need to look it up, they can. They don't have to go searching for it. But I guess that does raise the issue of if, let's say, that map changes or, the VSA document changes, right? Would it be attached to the same link? And if it's not, and we direct them to the wrong link, are we somehow liable for having misdirected them? Anyway, I guess, again, my ideal version is that that all these things would be linked, but.
So the other option is just to leave it. We enforce what's adopted, and if state law changes, then we're forced to simply amend our zoning to reflect that change in state law.
All right, we got a couple. I don't know who's next.
Ashley.
Then Jasper or Donna.
So for the definitions that are in here, have these all been compared to what state law defines them as, or are these just stock definitions?
There are a lot of stock definitions. There are very few defined terms by the state. There are some, but not.
I'm just looking at a daycare facility. There's definitely a state statute
there's definitely a state
deals with that.
Yep.
And I would just hate to create some right? So if you're trying to open a daycare in a new zone that's, a new district that's been created, and this says, means a licensed establishment that cares. I guess I would just be uncomfortable saying, well, this is how we define it, so you meet this, so there you go, and not providing anything else that goes along with that, because there's a state definition about what that is.
I'm fine with having this. If there's a state definition that they're required to follow by law, I'm fine with having it in there. I would like to just add my strong support for a dynamic e-document at the end of this process that includes those updated dynamic hyperlinks to all the references, even the ones I would add to that So, for example, lots and lots of these bylaws reference section 3113. It's referencing the own document, but to have to like scroll back down for like 15 pages and find 3113, that should be an active hyperlink. And I think this is certainly technology that many, many websites and web platforms use. It does not seem unreasonable to expect that.
And then if we could just have like a disclaimer that says, these were linked on this date. So.
Or the document on file at the administrator's office will be the default document should any error occur, whatever we have to do to cover ourselves. But that generally it makes it user-friendly, much, much more user-friendly.
I think that's a great goal to have. I guess I don't want to tie us up here with trying to define it all. I just want to caution, we do ultimately also have to provide a printed copy. So if the printed copy says one thing and only those that are using electronic says another, you're going to have to sort of balance that out.
There's no
There
need.
shouldn't be a difference.
There's no difference.
Well, if it is, if you're taking a link that takes you to a current statement and your other one doesn't, that's all. It's just, I think
Written the
something
same
that in the future
Added
it'll have to
bonus.
look.
Yeah.
But the text is the same and the information is the same.
Yep.
But if new law comes up, especially if they're differently named, as our legislature tends to be,
Well, then we'd have to amend the
Right.
definitions to account for that.
You have to update the links.
Right.
you have to update the
Okay,
printed too.
where are we on definitions? Are we we're good with this, where we are?
And Mike, what are your thoughts on adding hyperlinks at the end?
I think it's one that we would get to. I mean, I think we've talked about a couple of different ideas of going through and having new graphics drawn up. But I think once we get this adopted, we can kind of see where we're at and what the next policy step is, because that wouldn't be,
That's a pretty easy thing to do, though. If you're putting these online, adding hyperlinks, that's just...
Maybe
seems like
engage
a
our tech
logical thing.
department when they have some downtime, or they're outsourcing some of that work now. So if it's something that's a priority, maybe we can get it done that way.
I think this is mostly hyperlinked within Brandy's documents, so the way it's supposed to work when she's done accepting everything is it is supposed to have those where it says hyperlinked here to here. It's why some of these references keep ending up wrong, is because something gets moved and it's already linked in this document, so then it gets screwed up.
Okay, we're all good with...
So did we want to add anything to that, just to try to do the best we can with hyperlinks when we're done?
Oh, I didn't...
I think it's a
see
separate
that's
discussion
just a
Okay.
tech-
that
I
doesn't
don't
need to
think that's
cloud this,
a
but I
zoning.
just wanted to express my strong support for a functional document at the end of this that people can access and use.
So the
Okay.
final answer is we'll put the definition written in here with kind of the way we did it. I'll say like page 5.7 where it talks about farm structures as defined in 24 VSA 4413, and then I rewrite it. And that's what we want to do.
Okay, 169.
I am in strong opposition to removing the closet thing. I mean, as a renter, right? If you're like renting a one-bedroom apartment and there's no closet in there, like,
But don't you just know that? And
rent
then
it.
you, if it doesn't have a closet, you don't have to
Market
rent it.
determination thing. I don't think that it's our role as the city to say that. I mean, maybe I don't want a closet. Maybe I'd rather have a bureau or not use it as a bedroom
Or pay less rent.
Or maybe the leaving out of closets as a requirement allows for more bedrooms.
it's clear that I am outvoted, which I will certainly respect and have become accustomed to this. But I understand people's frustration if you're a homeowner or a landlord or whatever, but I mean, renters are already at a disadvantage. There's not a lot to choose from. Our vacancy rate is really low, and if you take away that requirement, you're then turning rooms that are offices typically or other purpose rooms. You're renting that now is what you're going to say that's a 3-bedroom apartment when it's really, a 2-bedroom with a small other room. I mean, I appreciate it and I understand people's frustration with it. It's concerning to me, and maybe I'm being.
I don't think it's a requirement under current zoning, so.
Okay, Justin?
Also, there are a couple requirements in Section 6 that may be covered in state law. So, for instance, requirements for a rental unit include, having a window in a bathroom or ventilation. So there are some existing state requirements that may come into play here. I don't think a closet is one of them, and I would be in favor of striking one closet and also considering striking the last part of the last sentence, at least 80 square feet, for the same reason that really it's up to the customer to decide what sort of dorm style best fits them at what price point, and so to be overly prescriptive here, I think, is a mistake.
I think Mike's suggestion was to strike the whole definition, that we don't need a definition of bedroom.
Bedroom out completely.
That it's actually not mentioned very often in here.
Agree.
I agree.
Okay, so if there's not any objection or further discussion, at least, we'll strike the definition of bedroom. Okay, 170. Why don't we actually, it's 8 o'clock, we've been going for more than an hour and a half. Take a break, take a 10-minute break with 5 minutes. Okay. Making great progress. We're going to, I think, get through the matrix, which is terrific.
Yeah, actually, the definitions end at the end of this page, so we've got 4 more, and we're just on to the public comment.
Great.
Oh, we lost Mike.
Maybe hard to read.
Well, everybody grabbed him at the table, John. Chris wasn't able to get away.
What's that? Oh,
They
yeah.
grabbed him at the table. But
That's fine. Yeah, we'll just hang tight.
I know, we didn't give you a chance to get a break.
All right.
Okay, item 170, 5101D16, definition of 3 and 4 dwellings. D16.
Yeah, so this one is almost a no-brainer. It just depends. If you read the 3 ways that the definitions are worded for each one, 3 and 4 family has this extra qualifier on the end that each unit shall have separate entrances to the outside or through a common vestibule that doesn't exist in multifamily or single and 2 family. So I don't think it matters, and we should strike that.
Agree.
It's just a note there that does come into play with state sprinkler ordinance, as we were just learning at our subcommittee meeting. I don't have a problem with striking it and then, develop, if a developer does their research and finds out that they would like to do one thing or the other per state law, then it's fine. But just a note that weirdly that actually does come into play there. Okay, if there's no objection, we'll strike that last phrase. 171, 5101D 14 to 16.
So this is discussed in the punch list items as well. It's found, well, let's catch up a little bit, but these are all...
Maybe, I'm sorry, okay. Can I just interrupt you, and maybe we should just take a minute to read your comments? That might help, if you don't mind.
And the number 57 it references is the 57 in this, Mike, right?
Yes.
All right, I guess I need an explanation. Maybe
All
others
right.
I've read it, but I don't.
The best way to think of it is through an example. What we're trying to tackle on is a little bit of a wonky question. Somebody is in the rural district and they have 20 acres, and somebody comes in and wants to build 5 single-family homes. Officially, you're not allowed to have multifamily housing in the rural district. So can I get 5 administrative permits to put 5 individual houses? If these 5 houses touched each other, they would not be allowed.
You'd have to
Because
subdivide.
5 of them are separate, you end up with this question of, okay, do we count the use by the number of dwelling units on the parcel, or do we count the use by the number of residential units in the structure? That's the fundamental question. That's really kind of being asked of, is which way would we like to do it? I would count by the number on the parcel. Sarah felt that was kind of strange and would count everything by the structure. But it does make a difference, especially for people with big properties, because every single-family home is a permitted use. So there's no public hearing, there's no public notice. So I could put in, on that 20 acres, I might be able to come in and put 10 houses without a public hearing, as long as I don't subdivide. I can just keep putting single-family homes on it. And at a certain point, it just kind of seems like it's kind of... I would cap it as the parcel, which means once you hit 5, even though there are 4 single-family homes, when you go to put the 5th on, that 5th single-family home makes the parcel multifamily. And therefore,
you're talking about the parcel as in the entire 20 acres?
The entire 20 acres.
And not the structure.
And because permits run on the parcel, you don't get a permit for a structure, you get a permit that runs with the parcel. I would call that multifamily, even though it's single-family homes. I would call that parcel is now multifamily, and therefore it would require conditional use in some districts or not be allowed in others.
Rosie?
Well, I think that there had been some interest from Ann and Ashley last time in revisiting whether or not we did have multifamily homes be prohibited in rural, or whether we make a conditional use. So maybe if we address that, then this becomes less of a...
Well, you still need a definition.
We still need an answer as to which way we would permit it, but the question would probably be at that point, is that a conditional use? When that person goes from 4 units to 5 units, is that another administrative permit, or have we now reached a point where it would be a conditional use and we would have to notify abutters?
I'd support parcel.
I was actually thinking per structure. That's what makes sense to me.
You can go hang out with Sarah.
Yeah.
Justin and I are going to hang out.
Can I tell you what I'd like to see, and you can tell me which way that would go? Because I'm still a little confused. I think that abutting, all the units in one building can sometimes be a more environmentally friendly way of doing construction. And so I don't want to discourage that if that's what someone wants to do, as long as we're not, then if the number of dwelling units is still at the same limit, whether they're together in one building or in these individual buildings, it doesn't really matter to me, and I don't want to discourage that more environmentally friendly way of building if it is something someone wants to do.
Which is why I'm interested in per structure. I think, as I understand it. What are your thoughts?
It could actually force them to be broken apart. If a multifamily structure would not, let's say the way the zoning is written right now, you can't have multifamily in the rural. So if somebody came in and wanted to do 5 units, downstairs we would have to say, yeah, you can do 5 units, but you got to break it up into 3 different structures. You can't have them all in one structure. So it kind of forces it out. Now, if you wanted to allow multifamily and have them grouped together, we'd also have to change table 214 to go and allow as a conditional use multifamily structures.
I'm a little confused about why I don't see a dissonance with multifamily and rural area. What's the reasoning behind that?
I think it just goes to some of the rural character. I think there are probably residents who live in the rural area who move in and live in that area because they don't want to live next to 8 units, 10 unit buildings.
I think it's fundamentally to the character of the neighborhoods. I mean, if you think of these rural areas, you want to see a 6-story apartment building on a field, on a farm field. That's not how we've developed typically in Vermont. So
I would just add too that I think we're all thinking about walkability and developing our core downtown, or where we want to encourage people to be for transit reasons and for vibrancy reasons, and to try to encourage them to be closer to downtown, I think is a good thing.
I do understand that, and yet I can imagine if there were multi-family dwelling that wasn't 3 or 4 stories, that was 1 story or 2 stories or something, and took up 2 to 3 acres and left 17 open. That's where I it's not as clear cut to me as it's sounding to you, I think.
Yeah, Donna.
I'm with you, because you can have attached homes that's multi-families, and that will use and maintain a more open space, and will have transit going out there or more bikes. I don't think it's just downtown that we need clustering, but I also think the equivalent of allowing more people of different economic levels to be distributed throughout our city and not just downtown is important.
I think this is solved by making it a conditional use, and that allows, someone who has a project that does, what Donna's suggesting, could probably get that through. Someone who has a giant, huge apartment building that wouldn't fit in that area wouldn't be able to get that through, or would have a higher hurdle to get that through.
Are we off of?
Yeah, a little
Yes.
bit.
We are a little bit off, but it can help to, that's a related question for one of the other ones anyways. There are only 3 districts that don't allow multifamily: Res 9, Res 17, and rural lands. And we've already started to have the conversation about adding, as a conditional use, multifamily to Res 9. I think essentially what we're having now is we could change the definition to regulate the parcel and then make these conditional uses, and we pretty much have made things flexible. But if something doesn't meet the character of the area, we're just counting on the process to do its job.
Right.
The process being, it's conditional use, it's got to meet the character of the area, and therefore if somebody proposes something, the DRB will deny it if it doesn't meet the character of the area.
I guess I just would like to bring us back to the definition of rural neighborhoods. The purpose of a rural district is composed mainly of large land holdings used for rural, residential, agricultural, forestry, recreation, open space, conservation, and other natural resource-based purposes. Generally, land in this district is not served by city and water and sewer roads capable of accommodating large and heavy amounts of traffic, et cetera. So, I mean, the whole purpose in having, if we don't want a rural district at all and we want it to have the same uses as other parts of the city, then we should change the district, not start to erode the structure that makes a rural district rural.
I just say, think of this as sort of what Vermont exists. Our whole development focus in Vermont is to concentrate development in our core municipal areas and leave our open surrounding fields available for forestry or fields of open lands for forestry, for recreation, but not to promote development. And I think we're just talking about turning it upside down, a really fundamental part of what makes Vermont unique. I mean, this is a really significant question, I think. If we're going to allow multifamily housing, large-scale development, even if it's a conditional use in our rural areas, you're talking about a dramatic change from what has defined Vermont for 200 years. I don't want to overstate it, but I think really that's what we're talking about.
It's a
I would add to that, too, that if this council feels that it is appropriate to have multi-use development in there, we should seriously be considering recategorizing some of these parts of town, not as rural, but as Res 6,000 or 3,000, so that they match those standards. That's really the policy decision as I see it, not to make permissible in rural what we also allow in Res 1,500.
So we
Yep, member of the public,
Ashley
Mr.
and
Mayor. Also, I don't know if we're
yeah, so let me take a couple of those, and then Joe, you haven't commented, so I was going to ask you if you wanted to. So, okay. Okay, let me hear
I guess
from
it's just,
Ashley and then.
it doesn't strike me that allowing a multi-unit dwelling is not necessarily in keeping with a rural area. I mean, if we allow it as a conditional use, it has to go before review, so they'll make the final determination and they'll look at the design plan. I mean, sometimes it's actually a little cheaper to live further out, and you can have multiple units out there. And that's not to say that we should have a 6-story building out there, but allowing for at least a review process to apply for the option to do it, I think makes sense.
Joe.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment as we're going through this discussion. Sometimes when I've been doing work out in like rural New Hampshire, they'll have a large parcel of land, and then a developer will go ahead and end up doing detached condos on this large parcel, which also would be, I guess, under this classified as multifamily. So I don't know if that's clouding the waters or muddying the waters even further.
Yeah.
And how that would be addressed.
Well, I think that's the question that's in here, is how would those be classified, right?
In a lot of those start getting into different options depending on how they want to mix it up, because what Joe's referring to is a planned unit development. So if somebody did a planned unit development, that kind of gets away from this issue in some ways. But what this is really looking at are those individual properties where somebody's doing something somewhat small and just keeps, and think about people who maybe are, well, I had a house and I put a tiny house on it. Now I got somebody else putting another tiny house on it. At what point do these administrative permits reach a ceiling where they need to go to the next level? If it remains by structure, every tiny house is another administrative permit. If it goes by the parcel, then you would reach a ceiling on that parcel by which, once you go to 5, you're a multifamily, and you'd have to meet the requirement of multifamily. If it's not allowed, then you wouldn't be allowed to put the 5th tiny house on, or the 5th mobile home on, or the 5th structure on.
All right, so on this, I think we're going to come back right to this other question about multifamily in Res 9000. Is that on another place?
It is in another place, so we will. Where it kind of comes back is there are 3 different places. One's in the definitions, one's in the figure 214, and one's in section 3001. So there's kind of 3
Okay,
places.
so we'll come back to that. So why don't we resolve this one, 171?
Can I ask you a question
Yeah,
about
sure.
that before we go on? Can we add to that conversation about Res 9000 also a conversation about rural multifamily use? Does that make-
Onto the table 214?
Yeah. Does that make sense? Because if the comment
Just seeing
is...
if I already have it here, so I just want to go.
Sure.
I've got
If the
it.
comment is about Res 9000, and we also want to talk about rural.
All right, I'll add to rural. It's actually on number 115, if somebody cares.
Okay.
That's where we had the discussion of the flashback to talk about conditional use for residential 9,000 districts.
All right, so we'll come back to that
We'll
one.
add rural to that note.
Great, thank you.
Save this one.
All right, so what do we, comments, thoughts about item 171?
Was Res 17 already included in that discussion?
I guess we'll put it in because it's in between the two.
The all through, right.
We'll touch the third rail of Town Hill.
Woohoo.
We're going to be covering, Res 9000 covers
Might as
about
well be
half the
consistent,
city,
right?
so I think we will be talking about just about everybody.
Yeah, everybody would be those. As I said, those are the 3 districts that.
Okay. I have to admit, I'm still not fully clear on the parcel versus structure, but maybe others are. Do we have, anybody want to?
Can we
support
come
a
back
parcel,
to that,
but
or do we have to
happy to come
decide
back to
tonight?
it.
Well, it's here. I don't know.
I'm support a parcel, but I'm happy to come back.
And the argument again in favor of doing the parcel, which is your view, is what, Mike? Could you explain that again?
So you will count whether you're looking at the zoning district or what your maximums are based on what your zoning, whether it's what's on the parcel. So if you have 4 single-family homes and you want to add a 5th, does that trip you into multifamily because the parcel now has 5
I
units,
see.
or is it another single-family structure and therefore it's another permitted use?
Okay, the zoning administrator's argument is that that's another,
Should be another structure
Structure.
and another single-family permitted
It's
use.
permitted.
And I think that is just, it can be abused, and I would count it by parcel.
You
Okay.
could resolve it if you had, say, you had a 20-acre parcel, you could always resolve it by subdividing that into 2 10-acre parcels and then putting 4 on each and
Which
putting
is
on 8.
probably
So
what
there's
would
another
happen
way
anyway.
around it. It would just be a more complicated permitting and approval
But
process.
to get the subdivision, you need to have a public hearing.
Yep.
So it's just, if you want to keep
I mean,
doing your
most of these are
administrative
going to be
permits,
subdivided, right? It's one
In which, in a
owner's-
rural area,
All
probably.
right, so I'm with you. I'm
makes
fine with
sense.
that. Other thoughts? Changing this to structure? Parcel.
I think I'm on parcel.
Can you just spell it out, like, one more time?
One more time.
One
Glad
more
I'm not
time.
feeling the only one who had
It
trouble
is,
getting their
and as I
heads
said,
around
it's
it.
really, it's
to look like the
really
idiot, it's
wonky,
fine.
but at the same time, it's one of these wonky things that just, it's a real-world case that we get that comes up. When people are building, especially building incrementally, and they start adding, you already have 3 single-family homes on a property, and you want to add the 5th unit. Is that 5th unit, if we're counting them by structures, it's another permitted use. You go downstairs and I give you the permit and you're good to go. If we look at the parcel, we would say, well, there's already 4 units on the parcel, so the 5th unit makes you multifamily for a parcel. Even though it's a single-family home, the parcel is now multifamily because it's got 5 families living on one parcel. And so if multifamily is not allowed in that district, you wouldn't be allowed to add the 5th unit without subdividing. So that's just it's kind of wonky, but.
Do you want more time to think about it, or are people okay? I think I saw a majority for this. We can come back to it. How about that? We'll have a default that we're going to change this to parcel, but we can come back if people contemplate it and want to.
It also sort of depends on how the conversation goes.
Correct.
with
This
that
will
other-
tie into the other
topic, so.
conversation. That's true.
All right.
Okay, 172.
Add the 30 miles in. I think that's makes sense.
Okay,
Agree.
there's no objection. We'll move on. 173.
We need to clarify basements and actually not counted in stories. I actually think we can. I think I probably made a discussion on this before making other votes, because I don't think we use stories anymore. So I think we actually can strike this altogether. Yeah, we can eliminate 16 altogether.
Okay. All right, and that takes us to
Longer measure in stories.
item 181.
So these are now from individual letters that were received after we had completed the document. So number 25 I have as a separate item on the punch list. So if we want to skip this one, we can grab it when we're done.
This is the same. This is,
I'm sorry.
we're on 181.
Yeah, number 25, number 181, number 205, and number 206 are all talking about the same thing.
And we're going to come to that on the
And we'll come to that
separate
on the
memo.
punch list.
Okay,
Yep.
I'm all right with that. Just doing that. with
Yeah.
those.
So for people who weren't here, I tried to go through and do a quick proofread. Things that are in blue are referenced somewhere else. The yellow ones are the ones that need addressing. So if people want to cheat and jump forward. 183.
So this next one that's not numbered, so we,
Continuation. It looks like
Oh, yeah, I thought it was the same
is it
It's a continuation of
continuation of 181?
Yep.
Mike, is that council discussion punch list that's I'm assuming that's the 25 reference that we just passed over?
Yes.
Is that document attached here, or do you have copies of that?
Oh, you
Just
don't have-
if we're cross-checking against what that discussion
You
is.
should, yeah, you should have a
This guy
memo.
here. Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Got it, thank you.
October 20th punch list. So we jumping up to
Okay, so we'll come
183?
back to 181 then on the other memo.
And 182 as well.
182, is that this, let's see.
That's another one that, number 24 is another one that has,
Didn't we already, I thought
we've
we
already,
already
I think
covered
we've
that.
already answered that one in its entirety, so.
I think we did.
Yeah, I think that one's already done. That one doesn't even have a punch list item.
Okay.
Yes, we made a complete decision on that one.
Okay. Okay, 183,
Infill housing on VCFA campus. So this was primarily, the reason for creating the campus PUD was to allow both, and the mixed-use zoning was to give that flexibility for infill housing. So I don't think we actually need to make any changes.
Because it's already allowed.
Because it's already allowed. If you read the campus PUD, or the campus PUD, it's pretty clear. The campus itself is in mixed-use residential, so it allows infill residential into anyways, and then on top of that, the campus PUD adds the flexibility that all conditional uses are permitted uses, so really, infill housing on the campus is really going to be, once they adopt a PUD, they're done.
Okay, 184 is just, I think, a general policy question about whether we need more housing, and I think there seems to be probably not the place here to have that conversation. 185.
Again, it's a policy one.
I would just make the comment that for the sake of lowering taxes is not the only reason to have affordable housing.
Yeah, the comment that was received was about the fact that an incentive for more housing is potentially lower taxes, and I know my office has tried to be very clear about the fact that this is not going to lower taxes. That's not the intention of the increased housing. It may be to help stabilize taxes, increase users for our water and sewer, but we're not, don't expect a decrease in your taxes because we're doing development.
Okay, 186, off-street parking requirement should not be waived, especially downtown. I strongly support this change, in part because we have had this sort of empty requirement that if you develop downtown, you have to provide parking, but then we'd waive it, or you pay a fee, you pay some dollar amount, so you're not actually, it's just a way to get more money. And the effect of it is to make development downtown more expensive without actually creating more parking. It just seems to me that that ought to be driven by the market. If you're going to develop, you're going to have to deal with your tenants' parking demands, whether it's a real commercial or residential. So,
I would agree and even go a step further in terms of asking council to consider adding Res 1500 in this consideration. But you can separate those and decide one at a time. But a lot of those fairly densely populated neighborhoods that we're looking to encourage infill development that are located in the core are in Res 1500 now. So. I would be in support of not requiring a set prescribed number of 1.5 spaces per unit or whatever is being prescribed, to eliminate that entirely.
I want to make clear then that you would support waiving the parking requirement.
Correct.
Okay. So that's, the comment is the opposite of that, though, so we should leave it as is. Which is the staff recommendation.
yeah.
The current draft is that there are no parking requirements in the downtown for urban 1 or urban 2.
Okay. So and staff's recommendation is to leave it the same, which is the same thing that Justin and John said.
Except for that Justin is suggesting maybe extending.
Taking a step further and eliminating the parking requirement for Res 1500.
The Planning Commission had a lot of debate on this issue. There were folks on the Planning Commission who wanted to have no parking requirements anywhere in town, and I kind of thought that was going, let's take it incrementally, let's do the downtown, and if that's successful, we can start working our way out. But I felt that certainly in places where we're parking challenged, that this could lead to much animosity for people who may develop in an area that has no parking and simply adds more parking to it.
So how does this work if somebody wants to add an accessory unit, say in Res 1500? Do they also have to find?
They would have to add one more parking space. Under the way this is drafted right now, they would have to add one parking space. So we've reduced the parking. So under today's zoning, I think it's 1.5 units per apartment. It's now 1 unit per apartment. So we've lowered the amount that you need, but we haven't eliminated it. It could go lower. But again, they're trying to take this process of removing parking requirements in an incremental step by step.
Is there any way that if I wanted to add that unit, but I would buy a transit pass or some other trade-off than just a parking space?
There are some back in 3011 that talk about other options for off-site parking that you could do, or there were a number of other options that you could do, shared parking with other uses, or if you could demonstrate that what you were doing, you could work within the same parking spaces that you had. So let's say you had residential on the top floor and office on the first floor, and you could go to the DRB and go and say, look, when these guys leave for work, these guys come in and work, I can use the same parking space twice. I don't need to have a parking space for all the office employees and a parking space for all my residents, because these guys leave and these guys take their parking space, and it works. So these new rules kind of opened up a lot more flexibility for people to make logical cases.
Okay, good.
I would just give a real-world example of a 5-unit building that has 5 spaces, and they've never all even been demanded in the 13, 14 years I've owned the building, that because of tenants who don't have a car or are looking for affordable housing and being close to downtown choose not to have a car. So making that a requirement is an additional burden, which then, of course, increases the cost per unit because you've got to provide an off-site parking space that you purchase. I mean, there are ways to get around it, but you're just going to basically pass those costs on to tenants who choose not to have cars.
Well, the other thing, I mean, is we're sort of telling people the street parking is for people who already live in this public space of street parking that people don't pay for is available for the people who live here now, not for somebody who might have an apartment in the future. And I just question the equity of that. It's the same principle as to downtown. We don't require any business downtown to provide parking, or didn't, but we have said if you have a new business, then you do have to have parking. And it seems like there's an inequity there. And I think the same thing could be true in a residential area where, you know, I've got off-street parking in my neighborhood, but if somebody wants to put in a new apartment, they've got to come up with their own parking.
Yep. It is an issue that will, you know, just ask people in Boston who go out and put chairs in their parking spaces on the street. That is not, that is a public street. You do not own that parking space. But try to explain that to people who live there.
And as someone who lived there for a long time, thankfully, I never had to resort to a chair in a spot. It came close. But I can actually appreciate, you know, I lived in the most affordable parts of town, which often didn't include parking there, and then you're kind of always wrestling, and I realize we are not Boston, but there is that sort of give and take, right? You know, if you're living in a more affordable place, it might be a little bit further out of town, so you might need a car or you might have to get to work, and so if we say, okay, fine, we're going to do away with all parking requirements, you know, for even Res 1500, I mean, I think we should just be mindful of that, and parking tickets can add up. I got a bunch of them in Boston, you know, and I just think we should be mindful of that as well, that it's not, you know, it's great if you live somewhere where you can walk, but there are still areas that aren't necessarily walkable, and you have to have a car if you work out of town, you know, and I would just be worried that we would be disincentivizing folks who might otherwise be interested in moving here if we say, you know, for all new development, we don't need parking spaces here, because I think people that are going to want to move here might need to drive.
I'm wondering about a compromise here for the specific neighborhood. Could we do 0.5 parking spaces per unit, understanding that if it's just one unit, you're going to have to go to one, but if you have a multi-unit building like Justin's talking about, that would reduce the requirement and kind of have a little bit of a middle ground for this neighborhood, which is in that middle.
That's not reality.
Yeah.
I'd be, I mean, it's a kind of a middle ground. I'd prefer to see it eliminated, but that's not going anywhere.
Anna, did you have comments?
I just want to say, just living in a condo unit for the last 16 years, we used to have 3/4 of our space open, and half of the building are seniors, as myself, and the cars have gone up. I mean, it's just amazing. And so I want to encourage less cars, but the fact is, people have cars, have reasonable needs for them, and to go to one space, I think, is an improvement. A half, to me, is just putting pressure on the whole neighborhood, especially with our winter ban. So I guess I'm more to agreeing just the one car for now, and we'll see how it works, see how the downtown core without any requirement works, and then modify it should that work better.
Particularly for new construction, in order to get loans, you often have to have certain parking anyway. So I guess I am more in favor of removing the restrictions, because if the bank doesn't think that we need them, then we shouldn't need that we think them, or think that we need them.
For Res
That one.
1500 as
For Res
well.
1500. But I would also add that I would be more in favor of, for 1500, potentially leaving the parking requirement, but saying that you can meet that requirement instead by offering, some kind of zip car, bus passes.
That's what he said was already there.
Well, you said there were some
I asked about
provisions,
it.
and I don't know if that included bus passes. It sounded like for buying parking spaces off-site, or Mike, can you clarify that?
I asked specifically about bus passes, and
I mean, there also could potentially be a trade-off where, if it's a new development or, a new multi-unit dwelling that's being built, I mean, if the developer's willing to work with the city to build a bus stop, I think that could alleviate some of that concern as well, because if you are working somewhere or need to get to somewhere where the bus service goes, that would address some of my concerns. I just feel like saying no need for parking in Res 1500 is not really realistic, given the number of people I know that live in that area that drive. I mean, I've been driving an hour and a half to work for 3.5 years, and if I didn't have parking, I couldn't live where I live. So,
And just for reference for everybody, these are the green ones, the green neighborhoods on the neighborhood maps.
So the way it's worded right now, under minimum amounts of parking, and I'll just summarize real quick. The minimum number of spaces determined on the table, which says 1.0 per dwelling unit. So if there was a request to make that smaller, we would amend the table. If there's uncertainty, the proposed use, the administrative officer will make the determination. The DRB, number 3, this is the key one for you.
I'm sorry, where are you reading from?
3011.c. That's page 3-58.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So number 3, the Development Review Board may waive some or all parking requirements to the extent that the applicant submits a parking study that demonstrates less parking will be needed. B, the applicant meets the requirements for shared parking. C, there's adequate on-street or public parking available within 1,000 feet of the proposed development to meet all of the potential demand. D, there is an existing proposed transit stop within a quarter mile of the proposed development, and or the proposed development will provide secure enclosed bicycle storage and shower facilities for employees who bicycle, jog, walk to work.
But that doesn't include anything about,
transit passes.
yeah, transit or, maybe that's shared
I think
parking spaces, but like, what about, zip cars and other kinds of shared vehicles?
to me, transit passes or that kind of membership thing is really difficult to put into zoning, because like, so someone buys a transit pass that first month, but are we going to then be enforcing this 20 years down the road, that some new tenant has to be buying transit passes in order for us to not
it wouldn't
revoke?
be the tenant, it would be the landlord who would have to do
Sure.
that if they're getting the
It just
parking.
seems
It's impossible
really hard to
for a
enforce.
zoning administrator.
Versus like saying that there has to be a transit stop, well, that's something you can build and then it's done.
I hadn't seen these additional exemptions, so I think this goes a long way. The one that says if there's adequate existing off-street parking, which I think is true in a lot of places in town. Donna and then Justin.
One thing that's happening in the topology, the street study, is the same thing that's happened, we did on Elm Street. We took parking away to make bike lanes. And the more we do that, the less we have street parkings. And the one thing I could justify to my constituents on Elm Street is, and thanks to one of their neighbors, we knew they had adequate parking for their needs in their house. And so to me, that makes it even more important that we have off-street parking, because I want more bike lanes.
Jess?
I wanted to come back to Councilor Watson's point about financing, because I think this really speaks to market pressures. The reason that banks and other financial institutions won't loan money to build apartments without parking spaces is because they know that there's a certain amount of demand for those parking spaces, and that the same is true for these rental units. If tenants have a car and need to drive and don't have a space, they're either going to they're either going to be interested in that product or they're not. And so to mandate that we price it into core downtown real estate, I think is a mistake.
I will say, though, Justin, that that indicates a degree of choice that I don't think currently exists in this town.
We don't
like
have enough.
there's not. I mean, right? Like looking for an apartment in District 3, for example. I mean, there's really not much available. And then when you sort of eliminate places that don't have parking, your pool is even smaller and less. Right? Like almost less affordable because you're further out of town, so you can't do the things that you otherwise would if you lived closer to town. So I appreciate that, and I think that in certain places that's probably true, but I don't see that level of choice here. And so if we say we're not going to require any parking for any new development, I think you're excluding a large population of people that might be interested otherwise in living there.
Okay, we ready for a show of hands on Justin's proposal to eliminate the parking requirement for Res 1500? All in favor, raise your hand. 4, all right. So that is, parking requirement of Res 15 is out. Okay, let's see, where are we? Are we at 187? 187. I think that's just a general comment.
What was that for? I thought the
2,
I didn't have my hand
3.
up.
No, yes, it
Yeah,
was. Ann did. There was
Ann
4.
did. Oh, okay.
What- Counting the mayor.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think this is just a comment, so I don't think there's anything to really discuss there. 188.
180 is really kind of back to Sabins.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental discussion. Is that in our memo?
Actually,
I think we
not
should-
in the memo. I think it's just one. There's not much more I can say on it. We really.
No, I
we've
think
got-
that I'm going to suggest we put that on hold, given the conversation that Doug Zorzi
that
asked. that
Doug
we
had.
had.
Okay. It is.
Okay, 189. Oh, so this goes to your footprint.
Yep, this
chart,
goes to
right?
the
Is this-
footprint, which I don't know if we want to have that conversation now or.
Might as well.
May as well. Let's dive in.
So it's one of my punch list items. So part 4, the comment was that footprint maximums are too high throughout part 2. The recommendation was based on the fact the waivers have been adjusted for footprint maximums based on Ann's recommendation that we lower these, lower the maximums, and then if somebody needs more than the maximum, they simply apply for a waiver, demonstrate that they can meet the character of the area, not impact the character of the area, and they can build larger. So it kind of was a more flexible approach. You do a small building, you can get an administrative permit. You do a big building, you're going to have to go to the DRB and notice your neighbors.
I think that the concern that Alan was raising is you have a 2,000 square foot house and then you have a typical size garage, you wouldn't satisfy the requirements in
So we could certainly.
in most of these districts.
So most of these were just recommendations that I put on this list, just so everybody understands. We went through, you see there's the zoning district, the sample size, the range that was in that sample, what was the smallest structure, what was the largest, what would be the 90% conformance number, which we just calculated. The recommended footprint I put in there. The notes are actually what are the largest buildings, what are the largest size that gets us to that 90% figure. Certainly, if people want these 2,500s to be 3,000s, that's I can make those. This is just information for you to digest and.
Donna, and then Rosie. I don't know who's next.
I would just want to clarify, John used the term 25,000 square house, but this is really the first floor footprint.
Just a footprint.
Well, so but if you have a one-story ranch house, I think that's the point he was making.
Okay, but so when you talk about the tall, old homes, this is not talking about their whole square footage.
Right.
It's just the first floor.
Right. So the example I was talking about would have been a one-story house.
Okay.
Rosie and then Justin.
I thought Alan's suggestion of taking the porch out of the footprint was interesting, and I wonder how much that would throw everything else off kilter if we didn't consider a porch as part of the footprint. And maybe that just messes lots of other stuff up. But if it doesn't, that's something I would be open to doing, keeping a smaller footprint, but then I don't feel that a porch necessarily adds to the visual mass of a building as much as the building itself or a garage or something like that.
Is it currently included? Porches are included?
Porches are included. I think some of it just comes down to a little bit of at what point does, I've seen some porches that are very well enclosed, and at what point does an enclosed porch become
true,
part of the
yeah.
house?
I think I may have raised a concern that I thought 4,000 was really high, just given, I mean, to Donna's point, that 4,000 times 3 is a 12,000 square foot house, which would be just enormously out of scale. But I'm also cognizant that 2,500 may not be the right number, so I mean, I'll just throw out a number, 3,000 may be a more reasonable number, but.
How would you feel about 3,000 in Res 15, 3,000, 6,000, and then go up a little bit, 9,000 to maybe 3,500?
In
Because you've got much
just walk
bigger
through
lots
those
out
again?
there. And
So they use 3,000 for which ones?
15, 3, and 6.
Yeah, and then
And
bigger
then
in the
maybe
larger.
3,500, a little bigger out there.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Now, is there a way that this can be reconsidered? For example, I also thought some of Alan's comments were interesting, and when he talked about a ramp, when he talked about an attached garage, he also mentioned the porches. So I thought he said, starting with a 2,000 square foot home, it could actually be 4,000 feet if there were an attached garage and so on. So if someone came in and said, I need all first floor living for this reason, I need the attached garage for this purpose, would we extend the maximum footprint?
There is no actual maximum. What the maximum is what you can get with an administrative permit. So you could build an 8,000 square foot house. You just have to go, if you exceed the maximum, you'd have to go to the Development Review Board and demonstrate that it won't affect the character of the area. And certainly if somebody had a legitimate reason, ADA reason, health and safety reason, it's going to be factors that work in their favor to go and say, we need this benefit.
Donna? Yeah. And then Justin.
If you go to the column of 90% conformity, I mean, rather than just picking numbers, what's recommended is within that range of what's 90% on the ground. So I like that. Again, if you want more, then you go and you get a review. So.
Mike, are outbuildings like sheds and other things that aren't directly attached to the primary residence, they do not add
They
into this
don't.
footprint? Okay.
Yeah, everything. This is just looking at this a single footprint structure
Of the primary residence.
Yeah, because what we're trying to look at is bulk and massing. The goal, this really kind of came out of the Sibley experience, and the discussion was, it was one big building, and everybody else has smaller buildings, and yeah, they had all the requirements that they could do it, but couldn't they break up the massing of that big building into 3 smaller buildings? And how could we require them to do that? Well, it's a footprint requirement to go and say, yeah, you can put in 16 units, but you got to break it into 3 smaller buildings because that's the way the rest of Sibley Street looks. And Sibley's buildings are all whatever, 2,000 to 3,000 square feet. So you should be between 2,000 and 3,000 square feet.
Ann, did you have a comment?
I know I've had my disagreements with the residents in that part of the world, and they know that. But I mean, in my view, I mean, I'm always going to want development that is more environmentally sustainable, and I mean, in my view, single-family homes are a product of cheap oil, and a remnant of 20th century, and so. I guess
Family homes are what? What'd you say?
I said a remnant of the 20th century.
A remnant. A relic?
A relic.
Huh.
Yeah, sure.
Dinosaurs.
Interesting.
But
I like the relic I live in, but
sure, either way. But so what concerns me is that because I'm not a big fan of just giant like McMansions, right? Versus buildings that are multi-family. because that to me is the most sustainable kind of development. So if, I guess what what I would want to see is the potential for expanding, I mean, maybe this is to do with density bonuses, I don't think so, but the potential to expand the maximum footprint if it's a multifamily dwelling.
Yeah, and actually I've had very little, other than the comments from Alan, the want for larger footprints has not come from people who had single-family homes. All the comments, and I've received a lot of comments and concerns about the maximum footprint, and primarily it's from people who want to develop multifamily, because people who look at projects for various projects on Elm Street or other places where there's somebody's got a large parcel and they say, you know what, I don't want to build 15 small houses, I want to put them into one unit, and because it's a big parcel, nobody's going to see it. Why can't I have a 10,000 square foot structure with 15 units in it? And you're like, well, because you're going to exceed the 3,000 square foot maximum footprint for that neighborhood. So I think it's actually, I've seen a number of these cases that came in. Caledonia Spirits, the fact that they've talked about, well, what if we need to expand? We're already over the maximum footprint. Well, the idea that, well, you just go in and demonstrate that you don't affect the character of the area and we can waive that requirement, puts a burden on the applicant, and it works.
So that's baked in, that if it doesn't affect the character of the neighborhood and and they can apply for that waiver, then I'm happy.
Yeah,
Although I think it's fair to say that if you go through that process, you often will have neighbors who would object to something new being built regardless of what I mean, that's
True,
not uncommon,
true.
that they would face significant public opposition to any level of development, so.
What have been the challenges for the current footprint maximum? I noticed that mostly they're reduced.
So the comments, these were the proposals. Most of the comments we received from the public via emails and letters and comments were that 4,000 square feet and 5,000 square feet, which were the maximums, are way too big, and we should not have those. Those need to be really drawn back. There's no sense even having a maximum if you're going to allow a 4,000 square foot house in my neighborhood. And so at the time, we had a maximum footprint that was a maximum footprint, and if you wanted a waiver, you could get a 10% increase, so maybe you could get 5,500, and it wasn't working for these larger projects on larger parcels. For example, these requirements would almost force a Sabins pasture project to do a whole bunch of small duplexes. You couldn't cluster them into a large multifamily structure because you'd exceed residential 6,000, you'd exceed 4,000 square feet or 2,500 square feet. Well, now, with the way the new rule is, with a waiver that says if you're over 2,500, you got to go to the DRB and we'll look at it, whoever's applying to work in that neighborhood simply has to go through a waiver requirement and demonstrate it won't have an effect on the character of the neighborhood. But I received a lot of comments that these are just egregiously high maximum footprints. And
So for the sake of discussion, I'm going to suggest that we change the 2,500 to 3,000 where it occurs in res 1,500, 3,000, 6,000, and 9,000, and that we change 3,000 to 3,500 in res 17,000.
9,000 and 17,000 or just 17?
Just 17.
So residential 9 would remain 3,000.
For clarification, when it says current footprint maximum, that means under the current zoning that's currently in effect, not the current proposed? It's under the proposed.
There
okay.
is no
Proposed.
footprint requirement under zoning today.
At all?
At all. Yeah, we added this in the span of our work on the new
Because of
zone.
Sibley.
Because of Sibley.
Because of Sibley that happened last
I
year.
misunderstood this table. I made the assumption that current footprint meant current
I thought
zoning.
so.
No, I'm sorry,
That's
I
what
should
I
have been
thought,
clear.
too.
Not
This is the current
proposed.
draft.
Thank you for that
Yes.
clarity.
The current footprint is the current draft.
That was their
What's in our
current
draft
proposal.
today.
After the public hearings, they changed.
I didn't get that.
Okay, other
My
thoughts?
apologies for not being clear.
Well, if we're making proposed amendments to the recommended footprint maximum, Mike, I would be curious to know your thoughts on our riverfront district, given that we are reconsidering the overlay of riverfront for a couple properties even tonight, does 5,000 feel like the right recommended footprint maximum?
Again, it's with the fact that you can apply for anything bigger than that, like Caledonia Spirits is 30,000 square feet. I think that's okay. I expect at some point we may in the future split Riverfront into two districts, one to reflect Stone Cutters, one to reflect Berry Street, just because they structurally different. But it's not something I'm proposing now or here. But there you can see that mix of housing of structure sizes in when you do the footprint sizes. The existing Riverfront 17,000. Those are the sheds, granite sheds.
So I guess I'd kind of rephrase the question a different way. Would 5,000 square foot first floor footprint be palatable to a developer who is looking to build a 16-unit apartment complex?
Yeah, they would have to just simply come in and get the footprint waiver, and it would be compared to whatever the abutter is. I mean, I'm sure a developer would tell you they'd rather not have to apply for the waiver and not have a waiver requirement at all. But I think the waiver requirement has been proposed
Reasonable.
in response to public requests that we have one.
Thank you.
And who decides that?
Development Review Board would be a waiver request for the DRB.
Okay.
Other thoughts? What do we want to do? Is there something out there, Donna?
Well, I think if you're making it bigger for a single home, does the opposite of what we're talking about trying to create the number of families in any one dwelling. I would rather have a little smaller footprint and have them come and then you review it so that you don't end up with any more big mentions around. So I would prefer to stay with the smaller.
I feel torn about that. I mean, I appreciate that there's a review process.
Remember, it allows you to build a big house without talking to anybody.
All right, what do we want to do?
I support the recommended changes.
All right, show of
Recommended
hands,
changes,
the
John.
ones that I threw. Everybody clear on what I was suggesting?
Can you reiterate?
Yeah.
So I was suggesting that we change 2,500 to 3,000 where it appears. So that would be in Res 1,500, Res 3,000, Res 6,000, and Res 9,000. And then in Res 17,000, it would change 3,000 to 3,500.
Okay.
Would show of hands who would support that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
That takes us to, let's see, I don't think 190, we need to, that's not a,
No, 190's blank.
just a comment. Okay, 191, I think we've already done that one, right?
Yeah,
We already
we-
made that change. 192, did we already do this?
Yes, that's already done. No change. It's already been voted on in 114.
Okay. And it looks like the other two, 193 and 194, we've already done.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to.
Come back to it,
to
okay?
them.
So the next comment, actionable comments number 200.
Sorry, did you say we're jumping to 200?
I think we go to 200. I think the other three are not comments that we can take action on.
Okay. Is there anything for us to?
I'm not sure. I think this is a very broad comment.
There's no action.
Okay, 201. Guess we've already, that's one we've already done, is that right?
I think so. Yeah, with the North Plain balconies, we already voted that one out.
Okay. 202. Are we missing a sentence there?
Yeah, see number 69, I think that one's already voted out.
Okay, so we've done we've addressed 202, 3, 4, 5, and 6, is that right?
Yep.
So that takes us to
Did
206.
we make a decision on 202 with riparian barriers and the like?
Thought we did, but I...
Mike, what was that decision? 69, I can look back, sorry.
No, that's all right. I don't-
There is it is actually in the punch list under 69, so we will come back to that one.
Okay.
I have some draft language. We made a decision, I was told to make draft
Oh,
language.
that's right,
Great.
yeah.
So-
That's
Right.
right.
Okay, so that takes us to 207.
There's a lot to do on that one.
Identified wording.
Working in Excel, it doesn't tell you
I know.
words are wrong
No, it
until after you
doesn't.
print it out, and you're like,
Got all the right letters there, just in the wrong
Type fast.
places.
I don't think there's much.
I don't know that we
in
can
one.
do that.
Which?
Well, I think that's, yeah, so the
You-
point is
you
that we
see
ought to be
one.
allowing dense development in our downtown area, but I think we do that, right? Isn't the zoning...
Well,
I think that's what I
Wow.
was trying to say in my comments, but I think that's what we do.
if I can make a comment on this,
Yeah,
is
sure.
I've also, I think, further along in the list have requested council consideration of UC1 and UC2, because there's not a lot of neighborhoods in these, and that, we have heard from the public that there's a section of our historic downtown right along Main Street by Kellogg Hubbard Library that it sounds like majority of people are in support of keeping it the way it is. It's a lot of traffic there. It's been preserved historically. And to categorize that the same as we do, for example, parts of Lower Berry Street may be a discussion that we should have. And so this is kind of touching on that. Come back to it later. But.
Yeah, and I think Mike is going
On
to
the punch
propose in your punch list that we separate that out into a separate zoning district. Okay, so I guess unless there's any comment, we'll move on to, we're working our way here, this is good. So Mike, I'm assuming, I'm kind of blowing through these, the blue ones we've already addressed.
The blue ones have already been addressed or are sitting in my punch list
Okay,
addressed.
so that takes us to 214.
Yes.
Alan had asked that we hold off on a couple of his comments, but I don't think it's these.
Yeah, so this one,
He had two, so he had two, so he says these broader comments, and then he had a few that were related specific to his property.
Right.
And I told him I didn't think we'd get, or we could come back to the ones that specifically related to his property.
yeah, I think I just picked two out of his, to put into the matrix, knowing that he had a big, long list. And so he sent first a 7-page comment. Those comments were sent to David Rue, who is comfortable with the city map and does not believe we need to address the concerns. So Nemeth's comment, a lot of it kind of went back to, is the natural resource inventory map legal? Can we do this? Those types of questions. Is it a taking? Our attorney is comfortable with the science behind defining natural communities and is comfortable defending the process. So,
Have we taken, any period of time where the data, where there's been observation made to confirm that it is in fact a riparian or a vernal pool? Or, do we have any evidence of this in terms of defending it?
the vernal pools that are on the natural resource inventory map were surveyed last year, so they are.
Okay.
So the natural communities were done in one study. The vernal pools were done in another. So a lot of times these get conflated because they're on the same map, but they were two different studies that resulted in two different data layers that are on the same map. So the vernal pools have been checked. They're on the map, and we are enforcing to the map. The natural communities were mapped in 2007. Our attorney, and I've got some background in this stuff here, and I'm comfortable with the process that was done to develop that map. And
I'm really sympathetic to environmental protection, but the notion of 500 feet, you can't develop within 500 feet of a vernal pool. Vernal pool could be a very small, like,
Size of this table,
can be really small.
I think, right? They can be
Yeah, it's on, and we've got a punch list. It's on the map, so it is only the ones that are mapped here that are going to be regulated.
That are subject to that 500 feet.
And
500 feet is just a big, I mean,
Yeah.
if we have a vernal pool that's that size and you can't develop within 500 feet, I mean, that would take you, like, I don't know, over to Main Street.
It is in the punch list, and so the one thing I'll just, really quick, I'll go and to mention on that is the regulations, and I've got some revised rules. The Conservation Commission wanted to clarify the fact that the vernal pools have only a 50-foot no-build zone. The other part of that 500-foot buffer are areas to minimize and mitigate impacts upon. So you can develop within that buffer area, but you have to go to the Conservation Commission, and they're going to provide comments as to how you can mitigate and minimize the impacts on the vernal pool. And we'll get to some draft regulations.
Okay.
And yeah, the second one was that one with the vernal pools.
Joe, I see, I know you're still here. Is there anything specifically that you want to comment on this? Okay.
Wow, on the last page. Woo, look at that.
Don't hiccup.
I think we're on 223, is that right?
223, yes. So this one,
Clarification on the 5th and 6th story setback in UC1 district.
this came as an interesting question to somebody who was doing a project
Dash 01.
in Urban Center 1 and was thinking about, we have a requirement in Part 2 that goes and says, well, if you're going to build the 5th and 6th stories, you have to set back the 5th and 6th stories 16 feet. And the question was, does that apply just to the front setbacks? Does it apply to the sides and rears? I mean, what setbacks does it apply to? And then there are two solutions that I propose here. One is to delete the requirement altogether, which I actually don't think is a bad idea. Many of the 6-story buildings that exist today in Urban Center 1 do not have that setback. The Pavilion building, a number of them. That requirement was built in when Urban Center was one big district that included Urban Center 2. So initially when we were drafting the zoning, Urban Center was one big district. And then we eventually said, you know what, Berry Street and Main Street really are different than State Street and Lower Main Street. So those became Urban Center 2. And the question is, do we really need to keep that 5th and 6th story requirement setback any longer? The second option is to designate which setbacks it applies to. I would recommend striking the 5th and 6th story requirement, but if the council would like to maintain it, then I would suggest applying it only to the front setback.
So I'm confused because I thought we stopped referring to stories. I thought we started just talking about height.
Technically, this would be the only place stories still exist.
Without a definition,
Otherwise,
though,
we would
right?
have to say any building property over 45 feet in height would have to be set back 15, 16 feet.
So this just applies to, this says for 5th and, buildings that have 5 or 6 stories, you have to have a 16-foot minimum setback? Others don't? A 4-story building wouldn't?
Correct. Yeah. So,
I would support striking that. I don't
Yeah, strike
see,
it.
I don't
okay.
see any basis for
What was the rationale behind it?
It goes for, it really depends on how your streets are laid out and how the buildings are. There are architectural standards for how wide, the wider the street, the higher the buildings can be without needing to be set back, or else it starts to become like you're in a big canyon. So in Berry City, we required the setback. So a good example, if you go by the new City Place in Berry, you'll notice it looks like a 3-story building, but it's actually has other stories that have been set back. So that way, when you're on the street, it doesn't look like a 5-story building, even though it is.
I would actually support keeping that setback.
I don't mind keeping the setback, but I really don't want to talk about stories if have struck the definition of story and Is there a way that we can go to feet and be consistent?
Boy, so many people talk about fifth and sixth stories. I can try.
Why don't we do
to-
the first, before you get to that, see if there's support for maintaining a separate restriction for
Because if we don't
buildings of
have
that
fifth and
height,
sixth
whether it's stories or height. And we would support striking the setback
Before
requirement for,
I have one.
Yeah, sure.
Kind of qualifying question before. It appears as though the same requirement is currently proposed to apply to UB2 as well.
It's already been eliminated in Urban Center too.
We've already did. we
Yeah,
did strike that.
it's been
Okay,
voted
thank
like
you.
3 times, and every time it's the one that almost got me whatever when everybody found out it was still there.
okay, so.
Is that that historic Main Street district, which is currently in UB2, isn't that the sort of place that you would want that setback to apply?
We set the maximum height for 45 feet, so there's no way of having a fifth or sixth story.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
Okay, so raise your hand if you want to support striking the setback requirement for fifth and sixth story buildings in UC1. 4, about 5, okay.
All right.
All right, so that takes us to
Feet.
220, well, you got one, yeah, let's see. I'm confused on the coloring. 225, is that the one?
Mr. Mayor, before we move on, do you mind if we just maybe, to Rosie's point, can we just switch it to feet so we're not referencing stories without a definition for stories?
Don't need to. There's
You don't
no
need
fifth
to,
and
'cause
sixth
we
story
just
anymore.
We just took it out.
It's the only
Great.
one left. It's
Awesome.
gone.
Okay, 225, remove N from Res 17,000 on table 214. Council requests, staff agrees it makes sense. So which, let's see, Res 17 is,
That's Town Hill.
oh, okay, and striking ends, okay.
Yeah, from the use table, basically.
Everybody all right with that? Okay. 228, we've already, I think we talked about that. The 228 and 229, we've already
So
covered.
229 is a related issue. That's the fact
Okay,
that
it's not the same
VCFA is in the design control district. And so VCFA would like to have those lower Res 6000 and Riverfront districts removed from design review. Because their intention, I believe, is to sell the riverfront portion to be sold for development, and therefore, it's only there because it's part of the college, so.
But not the campus itself. That would still be subject to
Campus
the
itself would
current.
still be in.
Okay, so there's a design review
Design
requirement that
review.
exists for that parcel that we've agreed would be riverfront zoned,
Yep,
and it applies to, it's design review only because it's part of the college, it's owned by the college?
yep.
Okay, then it seems to make sense to take that out if that, because it's really not, well, it's not part of the college now, and it wouldn't be if they sold it, so,
Yeah,
obviously.
but if it's on the map as design review and they sell it, then the applicant who buys it would have to then go through design review.
But any large development would still have to go through DRB.
DRB, just
But
not
not
DRC,
through-
yeah.
I'm all right
I
with
want to be
taking
clear
out.
that would not, approving this change would not release the college from the design control that all the buildings they currently own are subject to. Is that correct? Just this undeveloped parcel that we
Yes.
were discussing earlier tonight?
Just for the record, Mike, your answer's yes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm
Thank
just
you.
putting a note here that
Sure.
says remove Res 6000 and Riverfront, just so we're clear. Those are the only two that are being removed from design review.
Okay. The Goldman request to change the zoning map, is that on the punch list that we're going to take? Well, actually, I'd rather wait to take that up if we
it's-
could when he's here, because.
It's not on the punch list, but it's a relatively easy request.
Okay.
So going back to our big stack of requests. One,
Is that the green one?
yep, 2,
Page
3,
6.
4, 5. So you can either look at 5 or you can look at page 6. Page 5 is a little bit easier to see in that it has these little red dots. The little red dots are what is actually the current, in the zoning document here, the current boundary between, this is all his Crestview and his rural land. He owns land in 2 zoning districts, rural and residential 9,000 and rural. And what we tried to do through a number of adjustments was to try to get the land that was the most agricultural land into rural, and the land that was not good into a development land. It went all the way up, and we went and made this line up to the road, which put his barn and house into rural, and he has now decided he does not want his barn and house in rural. He'd rather have his barn and house in Res 9, so he wanted to go to those blue dots. I'm fine with that, so I don't think there's a big issue with that.
It makes sense to me.
Mike, can I just check which neighborhood? I'm trying to kind of just look at a different view of this same map.
He would be in Crestview and
Split, okay.
rural
Terrace Street.
west.
Western rural. Sound right?
Western rural, does that sound right?
So we're.
So what we're talking about here, Mike, the only change is
Yeah, that
to
looks about right.
change the red line to the blue line
And bring his barn in.
to bring the barn
If this
and
red
house.
line would go away, that blue line would be added in.
Okay. Everybody okay with that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
The blue line.
Okay, so take that red line out, we go to the blue line, that's his request.
Okay. And this is now.
Here's Terrace Street.
Yeah, but this.
This has already been moved.
What's this new overlay?
This is
Awesome, Mark.
Res 9.
No.
Not
I'm
tonight.
voting
Just
for
a
next
slight
week.
boundary.
Yes, this is,
It's also super late.
this would have been adopted
You want
as,
to tackle the controversial stuff like
and
that.
he wants to simply strike that and go to this, so this would
Yeah.
all be Res 9. That would be all.
His barn is a little white thing.
It makes it a butt.
Everyone else got it?
Yeah, I think.
I think we're all set with that one. All right, so the question is, do we plow ahead or do we
No.
call it good?
No.
All right, we're going to have insurrection here, Rosie.
I
think
was
you're
going to
gonna-
suggest that I had kind of gotten the sense, and if I'm wrong, then definitely let's push it off, but that the idea of splitting that Main Street section into its own UC district sounded like maybe it wouldn't be controversial, and maybe we could just go ahead and do that? Tackle one of those things, or
I'm
as
just
Mike
being-
had suggested?
I have a big day tomorrow and had bargained for
I think we've
9:30.
got. I think we have a manageable scope left, don't you
Do we
think,
mind?
Mike, for
How do
one
you
meeting?
feel?
Do you
We
think
just, as far as I know, we
This is
just
it,
have
I
what's on the
think.
punch list, and
And I think we can do this in one night, 2 hours, don't you think? What's left?
the thing to keep in mind for next time is we still have to have a discussion on the river hazard, so just so we don't forget. There are the river hazard regulations, so.
Those aren't controversial, though, are they?
Those aren't controversial. I haven't had any comments on them, but
Okay, so
they're,
I think
I
that's
just
gonna
wanted
happen,
to.
so you're right. Is there, I haven't read your memo, but, I mean, is there any reason that we wouldn't be able to get through this in 2 hours that you know of?
I think if you read through most
Or
of
we
these
can
would
stay
be.
late, so, I mean,
I'm fine
next
staying
time.
late next week. I just have a
Okay.
trial tomorrow that I have to prepare for.
And a couple of these
All
we've
right.
already done, so we'll.
I think we're going to call it a night, and then we're going to finish up next week, and I think it's great work. I think we've made just tremendous progress.
I will update your matrix. I will also update, because I didn't send this to you electronically, and we have completed some items on this, I will update the punch list and get that out to you tomorrow or Friday, so you guys have it.
Rosie?
Can I just ask about the process? So you're going to take all these changes that we've agreed to, and it's going to go back to the consultant, and they're going to update the actual text, and then that's what will be warned for a hearing. And we
Yes.
will get a chance to obviously read it through cover to cover with all those changes.
Yes.
And that timeline all is, the consultant has time to make all these changes.
She has said she will make the time to get this done, and we're very appreciative of the fact that she is years past her contract and is not doing this and sending us bills. So we're very appreciative of all that she's doing to help us wrap this up.
And we'll have time to then read it.
And we should. So the plan, I'll take two minutes to kind of go through what's left of the schedule. So Monday, which you read the papers, Planning Commission met and they reviewed the draft master plan and all the changes and the updates of information and statistics and made a couple of minor tweaks and have voted that on to you guys for consideration. So that is now on the way for you guys to consider the master plan as well. So that step is done. That you guys need 30 days before you guys can do anything, so that's kind of in a limbo period, which is in our timeline. It's already planned for. Your schedule talks about needing to be done by the end of November 1st because we need to have a window of time to get those changes done so we can warn yours as well. And so my goal is to have that done by November 9th or 10th. So if you guys are done on the 1st, I can make those changes by November 1st, and then I'm warning for 2 public hearings on December 13th and 20th. So zoning only requires 1, but if we're already warning 2 for the master plan, it's certainly your choice, your call, but I would imagine that if we're going to have a hearing, we would probably have a hearing for the master plan and a hearing for the zoning on the 13th and a hearing for the master plan and a hearing for the zoning on the 20th. On the 20th, assuming no major substantial changes, you guys would have the right to adopt both if you wanted to. And we have a window of opportunity if something comes up that we could have a meeting on the 3rd. So if something comes up where we say, oh boy, we got to fix something or have our attorney review something, we have an opportunity to review it, and we could review a continued hearing to the 3rd. So that's why we've kind of set it up the way we did. So we're perfect, we're great, we're on time. If we've got all this ready to go for the end of the 1st, then we're all on schedule.
Okay, great. Joe?
Mike, which 3rd? November 3rd, December 3rd?
November 3rd.
Nope.
Yes, November 1st we're meeting.
January 3rd.
We're meeting November 3rd. I didn't hear
He's
it.
talking about January 3rd. We could potentially have
January
a meeting
3rd.
on January 3rd.
Yeah. Yeah, January 3rd would be the fallback date because the absolute last date's January 9th, I think our attorney said.
Something like that.
That's the death.
I'd just like to confirm then, we were given kind of a soft October deadline as a council to do our due diligence and get our work done. We still have a few open ends here, but have we met our requirements or we have not at this time?
Have not. I need all of the changes that you guys are going to make so I can take them to our
Next week is dead.
consultant.
And that's
And
Dead
so
meeting.
November
Next
1.
Wednesday's drop dead.
that next,
for our work.
we've talked about November 1st is basically the drop dead. We'll have to make all decisions on next week.
What time are we starting next week?
6 o'clock.
I just wonder about adding
6
30
o'clock.
minutes to that, which I know is tough for a few folks, but given that, if that date is a drop-dead date, would that,
Should clear the agenda and make zoning the only, is there?
Have work to do that today. We finalized the agenda and really worked to try and clear the decks. There are a few things we can't wait on, but Ashley, do you have any flexibility? What
I'll
do
be
people
working
think?
in Barry that week.
Oh, way to go. Congratulations. All right. Any interest in starting at 5:30?
I would do that.
Yes.
Certainly, can do it.
No one objects to eating at our desks then.
All right. Could you relay that to Jamie to make sure that gets posted, that agenda gets corrected?
All right, I will
And we will start at 5:30.
return to Sue, but I don't have Sue here either. 5:30, and that's next week.
Next week, yeah.
Does it start, because her first question is going to probably be, are we starting with consent and all the regular items, and then
So I think we'll do 5:30 to 6:30 for those items, and then
for those items,
6:30
6:30
until
start
we
for zoning?
finish for zoning,
To
yeah.
just basically shift everything?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I think we should be able to get everything else done in
I
an
think so.
hour,
There's not a lot here, so maybe quick.
Okay, and since this was just zoning, I'm going to skip council reports unless anybody has something they would like to share.
I
Jen,
do.
Feel free. All right.
Just quickly.
Yes, Ashley.
So I wanted to thank everybody for being so supportive and mindful of the sort of gendered language in the zoning requirements. A friend of mine is an executive director of a women's organization out in Wisconsin, and the city council out in Eau Claire in Wisconsin just voted to disallow a breastfeeding mother on the council from feeding during the council meeting, and I was really appalled to hear that. And I just want to thank all of you for being so aware of these issues, and I look forward to sort of carrying that awareness into everything that we do here on the council and as we go into budget season and every other thing that we do. So I want to thank everyone for being so mindful of that.
Thanks, Ashley.
John,
Anybody else? Yeah, Jane?
I have something that's date-specific, and it might be interesting for folks to go to the downsizers meeting on Saturday morning at the library from 10:30 to 12. As you know, there are more than 200 folks who've signed on to emails. These folks are still looking, hoping, working toward market-rate housing, and you might be interested to hear what kinds of thoughts they have, questions they have. Typically, there's a developer or two there, and pretty open discussion about wanting to stay in Montpelier and how can they. So that's Saturday morning, 10:30 to 12.
Thank you, Chief.
Well, I was at the Regional Planning Commission meeting last night. I'm on the Transportation Committee, and Montpelier got an $18,000 grant, of which the Montpelier Transportation Committee worked with the staff for flashing beacons. So we're going to have a set of 4 flashing beacons be going up, and we have it in our budget to have 4 more next year.
Great.
And they're the kind you push, and then they have LED lights to light them up bold.
That's great. Good, terrific. Yeah,
One other brief note, I want to acknowledge city staff, Chris Lumbra, and all the people who worked to have the Econo Lodge buildings removed. They are gone now,
Thanks
and
for
residents are very happy
making
about
note
that.
of that. That's great. Anybody else?
I want to thank Tina for being here. I was here. Tina, I'm thanking you. Tina, Ruth. Thanking her for being here and attending so many of our meetings, and you were there Monday night at the Planning Commission, and I appreciate your participation and follow through.
Great. Thank you, Tina. Thanks for your diligence and hard work. Okay, without objection, we will adjourn at 9:40. Thank you, everybody.
So have trials more often. Get us out of here.
No.
Congratulations.